The desert wind cuts through the darkness at the ancient city of Ur, carrying whispers of sand across ruins that have slept for millennia. It is 1922, past midnight, and the excavation site lies silent, except for the rhythmic scraping of a single trowel against packed earth. Leonard Woolley cannot sleep. For 6 weeks, his team has been uncovering the standard findings: pottery shards, brick foundations, the expected remnants of Sumerian civilization dating back to around 3500 before the Common Era. But tonight, something has pulled him from his tent. His lantern flickers as he kneels beside the trench where they stopped working at sunset. There, partially exposed in the wall of stratified earth, he sees it, a clay tablet, but not like the others. Even in the dim light, he can tell this one is different. The symbols are wrong. They are not quite cuneiform, not quite anything he recognizes from his years studying Mesopotamian texts. His hands tremble as he brushes away the surrounding soil, careful not to damage what might be the find of his career, or the end of it. The tablet comes free. It is heavier than it should be, dense with age. Woolley holds his lantern closer, and what he sees makes his breath catch in his throat. The writing system predates standard Sumerian script. The clay composition is different, fired at temperatures that suggest technological knowledge the ancient Sumerians were not supposed to possess. But it is the context that truly unsettles him. This tablet sits in a geological layer that, according to every dating method available in 1922, should be at least 8,000 years old, perhaps older. He looks up at the star-filled Iraqi sky, the same stars that witnessed whatever civilization created this artifact, and a single question forms in his mind. A question that, decades later, institutions will spend considerable resources trying to suppress. If the Sumerians were not the first, if there was something before them, something sophisticated enough to write, to record, to remember, then what happened to them? Where did they go? And more importantly, what were they trying to tell us? The tablet in Woolley's hands that night contained fragments of a list. Not a king list, not a religious text, but something far stranger, a chronology, a timeline that stretched back not thousands of years, but tens of thousands. A record of cities that existed before the flood, before the Anunnaki, before everything we have been taught about the dawn of human civilization. The official excavation reports barely mention this tablet. It sits today in a museum basement, catalogued with a number but little context, available to researchers by appointment only. Very few ever request to see it, because if that tablet is genuine, if its dating is accurate, then everything changes. Human history, as we understand it, collapses like a house built on sand. The carefully constructed narrative of our species' journey from primitive hunter-gatherers to civilized city builders becomes a fairy tale, a convenient fiction that ignores millennia of forgotten knowledge. And someone, somewhere, decided a long time ago that we are not ready to remember what came before. Hey there, I am Mr. H, and if you are anything like me, you have always suspected that the official story of human history has some pretty convenient gaps in it. On this channel, we dig into those gaps. Literally and figuratively, we follow the evidence wherever it leads, even when it leads to places that make academics uncomfortable. If that sounds like your kind of journey, go ahead and subscribe. Hit that notification bell, because what we are about to uncover in this investigation goes deeper than almost anything we have explored before. Trust me, you will want to be here for all of it. So let us ask the question that Leonard Woolley could not answer back in 1922, the question that still hangs over archaeology today. What civilization existed before the Sumerians? What knowledge did they possess? And why has their story been systematically erased from our collective memory? The story we have been told about human civilization is clean. It is linear. It makes sense. For 200,000 years, humans wandered the earth as hunter-gatherers, living hand-to-mouth, following animal herds, leaving behind nothing but stone tools and cave paintings. Then, around 3500 before the Common Era, something miraculous happened in Mesopotamia. The Sumerians appeared, seemingly out of nowhere, with writing, mathematics, astronomy, agriculture, law codes, and urban planning. Civilization began. Just like that, fully formed like Athena springing from Zeus's forehead. Except that is not what the evidence shows. Not even close. Let us talk about the problem that archaeologists do not like to discuss at dinner parties. The problem that gets research proposals rejected and academic careers quietly derailed. I call it the blank spot, and it represents roughly 4,000 years of human history that simply does not add up. On one end of this gap, we have Göbekli Tepe in modern Turkey, a megalithic complex that was built around 9600 before the Common Era, that is 11,600 years ago. The site features massive T-shaped pillars weighing up to 20 tons each, arranged in circular patterns, covered in sophisticated carvings of animals and abstract symbols. The level of organization, artistic skill, and astronomical knowledge required to build Göbekli Tepe suggests a complex society with specialized labor, advanced planning, and a cosmological understanding that rivals anything the later Sumerians achieved. Then we jump forward to around 3500 before the Common Era, and boom, there are the Sumerians, with their cities and ziggurats. But where are the transitional societies? Where is the evidence of civilization slowly developing over those 4,000 years? If you look at the archaeological record honestly, what you find is not a smooth progression, but a series of disconnected islands of advancement, separated by oceans of silence. It is as if someone took a red marker to the timeline of human development and just crossed out 4 millennia worth of progress. The mainstream explanation goes something like this. After the hunter-gatherer phase, humans gradually learned agriculture in the Fertile Crescent around 10,000 years ago. They domesticated plants and animals, settled into villages, and over thousands of years, these villages grew into cities, and boom, Sumerian civilization emerged as the natural culmination of this process. Simple, logical, completely inadequate to explain what we actually find in the ground. Because here is what that narrative conveniently ignores. The Sumerians themselves did not claim to be the first, not even close. Their own texts, written in their own hand on clay tablets that still exist today, explicitly state that they inherited their knowledge from those who came before. They had a word for these predecessors. They called them the people of the Antediluvian cities, the civilizations that existed before the Great Flood, and they did not speak of them as primitive ancestors slowly figuring things out. They spoke of them with reverence, as masters of knowledge that even the Sumerians were still trying to fully understand. Let me read you something from the Eridu Genesis, one of the oldest texts we have from Sumerian civilization. This tablet, dated to around 1600 before the Common Era, but clearly copying much older sources, lists 5 cities that existed before the flood waters covered the earth. Eridu, Bad Tibira, Larak, Sippar, Shuruppak. These were not villages. The text describes them as urban centers with kings, temples, and sophisticated social hierarchies. And the kings who ruled these cities had reign lengths that seem to mock our modern sensibilities. Alalngar, a king of Eridu, supposedly ruled for 28,800 years. Enmenluana of Bad Tibira, 43,200 years. Dumuzi, the shepherd king, 36,000 years. Now, modern scholars look at these numbers and immediately dismiss them as mythological exaggeration, symbolic rather than literal. They say these numbers represent something else, dynasties rather than individual rulers, or perhaps a different calendar system that we are misinterpreting. And maybe they are right. But maybe, just maybe, we should ask ourselves why we are so quick to dismiss what these ancient people were trying to tell us. The Sumerian king list, preserved on the Weld Blundell prism, which you can see today in the Ashmolean Museum at Oxford, makes a very clear distinction. Before the flood, kings ruled for impossibly long periods. After the flood, reign lengths suddenly become normal, ranging from a few years to a few decades, exactly what we would expect from human monarchs. The text itself marks this transition explicitly. The flood swept over. After the flood had swept over, when kingship was lowered from heaven, the kingship was in Kish. It is as if the authors were saying, yes, we know these pre-flood numbers seem impossible, but this is what the records show. This is what happened. What if they were telling the truth? Not the truth as we understand it, but the truth as they experienced it, passed down through oral tradition and earlier written records now lost to time. What if there really were antediluvian civilizations, and something about them, their biology, their technology, or their relationship with time itself, was fundamentally different from what came after? But let us set aside the king list for a moment and focus on something even more problematic for the standard narrative, the Sumerian language itself. If you have ever studied linguistics, you know that languages evolve. They change over time. They borrow words from neighbors. They simplify or complexify based on cultural needs. We can trace language families back thousands of years, watching how Latin became French and Spanish and Italian, how Proto-Indo-European branched into dozens of modern tongues. Every language on Earth fits into some kind of family tree, some evolutionary pattern that shows its development over time. Except Sumerian. Sumerian is what linguists call a language isolate. It has no relatives, no parent language, no evolutionary tree. It simply appears in the archaeological record around 3200, before the Common Era, fully formed with a complex grammar system that includes noun cases, verb aspects, and a sophisticated way of building compound words. It is like finding a Boeing 747 sitting in a field in the year 1903. Sure, it is a flying machine like the Wright brothers built, but the technology gap is so enormous that you have to ask where it really came from. Compare this to Egyptian hieroglyphs, which we can actually watch evolving in the archaeological record. Early Egyptian writing is clearly pictographic, slowly becoming more abstract and phonetic over centuries. We see the development happening in real time through the artifacts. Sumerian cuneiform shows no such evolution. The earliest examples are already using abstract wedge shapes pressed into clay, already representing syllables and concepts rather than simple pictures, already demonstrating grammatical sophistication that suggests centuries or millennia of prior development that we simply do not have evidence for. Unless that development happened before, unless the Sumerians inherited a writing system from their antediluvian predecessors and adapted it to their own needs. That would explain why it appears complete. That would explain why they had words for concepts and technologies that should not have existed yet. That would explain why their earliest texts are not primitive attempts at communication but fully realized literature, including poetry, legal codes, and scientific observations. The Sumerians had words for planets they should not have been able to see without telescopes. They had mathematical concepts that we did not rediscover until the Renaissance. They had medical texts describing surgical procedures with anatomical knowledge that required centuries of study to accumulate. Where did all this come from if they were, as we are told, the first civilization? The official answer is that they figured it out themselves over a few centuries of rapid development. The unofficial answer, the one that gets you funny looks at academic conferences, is that they remembered it. They inherited it. They were the survivors of something much older, much more sophisticated, something that was nearly destroyed in a cataclysm so devastating that it took thousands of years for humanity to recover. And when they did recover, when they finally rebuilt cities and reinvented writing, they wrote down everything they could remember about what came before, even the parts that seemed impossible, even the parts about kings who lived for 30,000 years, and cities that sank beneath floodwaters, and knowledge that descended from the heavens. We call it mythology. They called it history. And somewhere in that blank spot, in those 4,000 missing years between Göbekli Tepe and the first Sumerian cities, lies a chapter of human history that we have forgotten, a chapter that was deliberately buried, whether by the forces of nature or by human hands, we have yet to discover. But the Sumerians remembered. Their texts are not fairy tales. They are archive reports from a lost age. And if we are brave enough to read them, without the filter of our modern assumptions, they tell a story far stranger than we have been prepared to accept. Before we go deeper, I am curious. Where in the world are you listening from right now? What time is it where you are? Drop your location and the time in the comments. I love seeing how this investigation into forbidden history connects people across continents and time zones. Whether you are in Tokyo at dawn, London at midnight, or somewhere in the Amazon at sunset, we are all chasing the same mysteries together. It is 3 a.m. where you are, and you are still watching. You are exactly the kind of person who needs to hear what comes next. Now, let us move beyond the Sumerians and look at who came before them, because the blank spot in history was not actually blank, it was occupied by a civilization that has been hiding in plain sight for over a century, dismissed by mainstream archaeology despite overwhelming physical evidence. A shadow civilization that built the foundations upon which Sumer would rise. They are called the Ubaid culture, and what they left behind is deeply unsettling. If you search for the origins of civilization in any mainstream history textbook, you will find a neat chapter on ancient Sumer, cuneiform writing, ziggurats, the wheel, city-states like Ur and Uruk rising from the Mesopotamian plains around 3500 before the Common Era. What you will not find, or what will be mentioned only in passing, is a single paragraph buried somewhere in the footnotes, is the culture that came before them, the people who laid the foundations, literally and figuratively, for everything the Sumerians achieved. A civilization that thrived for nearly 3,000 years, building temples, developing agriculture, establishing trade networks, and creating art that remains deeply unsettling to this day. They are called the Ubaid culture, named after the archaeological site of Tel al-Ubaid in southern Iraq, and their existence poses a fundamental problem for anyone who believes they understand the ancient world. The Ubaid period stretches from approximately 6500 before the Common Era to 3800 before the Common Era. That is not a typo. We are talking about a sophisticated culture that existed for millennia before the Sumerians supposedly invented civilization. And the evidence is not speculative. It is not fringe archaeology. It is mainstream, peer-reviewed, carbon-dated fact. The Ubaid people created distinctive pottery with geometric patterns that appear across hundreds of miles, suggesting either extensive trade or cultural unity. They built permanent houses using mud brick, the same construction technique the Sumerians would later use. They created temples with specific architectural layouts that would become standardized in later Mesopotamian religion. They developed irrigation agriculture that allowed them to support populations far larger than hunting and gathering could sustain. In other words, they had civilization, organized society, technological advancement, everything we associate with being civilized. And they had it 2,000 years before the Sumerians supposedly invented these concepts. The site of Chogamami in eastern Iraq provides some of the most compelling evidence. Excavations there in the 1960s and 70s revealed sophisticated irrigation canals dating to 5500 before the Common Era. These were not simple ditches. They were engineered waterways designed to divert river flow, manage seasonal flooding, and deliver water to agricultural fields miles away from the main channel. The level of planning and communal organization required to build and maintain such a system indicates a society with centralized authority, specialized knowledge, and long-term thinking. You do not build irrigation systems that will take decades to complete unless you have confidence that your civilization will still exist when they are finished. But it is the religious architecture that really makes you stop and think. At Tel al-Ubaid itself, archaeologists found the remains of a temple complex that predates the earliest Sumerian structures by over 1,000 years. This was not a simple shrine or a stone circle where people gathered to pray. This was a sophisticated building with multiple rooms, decorated facades, and evidence of ritual activity, including animal offerings and ceremonial objects. The layout of this temple, with its central courtyard and surrounding chambers, becomes the blueprint for every major temple the Sumerians would later build. The famous ziggurats of Ur and Uruk are essentially elevated versions of the architectural plan that the Ubaid people invented. So why do we not learn about this in school? Why is it that when people think of ancient Mesopotamia, they think Sumerian, not Ubaid? The answer is uncomfortable. It is because acknowledging the Ubaid culture forces us to confront the fact that civilization did not begin suddenly. It did not appear out of nowhere. There was continuity, inheritance, a passing of knowledge from one culture to another across thousands of years. And if that is true for the transition from Ubaid to Sumerian, then why would it not be true for the transition from whatever came before the Ubaid to the Ubaid themselves? The question becomes, who taught the Ubaid people? Where did they get their knowledge of irrigation, architecture, and organized religion? Because the archaeological record shows them arriving in southern Mesopotamia already possessing these technologies. There is no evidence of a slow developmental phase where they figured things out through trial and error. They appear, much like the Sumerians after them, with a cultural toolkit that seems too advanced for people who supposedly just transitioned from nomadic life. And then there are the figurines. We need to talk about the figurines, because this is where the Ubaid culture crosses from merely interesting into deeply strange territory. Throughout Ubaid sites, archaeologists have found thousands of small clay figurines. At first glance, they look like typical ancient art, the kind of religious or cultural objects you would expect from any prehistoric society. But when you look closely, when you really examine what these figurines depict, something feels profoundly wrong. They are humanoid, but not quite human. They have elongated heads, sometimes almost conical in shape. Their eyes are large and slanted, often represented as coffee bean shapes or slits. Their faces are reptilian, with pronounced snouts or lizard-like features. Some have broad shoulders and clearly defined arms and legs. Others appear to be nursing infants, playing with children, or engaged in everyday activities. And all of them, every single one, has this unsettling non-human appearance. These are not abstract representations. They are not stylized art where the artist exaggerated features for religious symbolism. They are detailed, carefully crafted figures that show anatomical consistency across different sites and different time periods. Whoever made these figurines was trying to depict something specific, something they saw or believed existed, and they felt it was important enough to create thousands of these representations and bury them in graves, place them in homes, and include them in religious contexts. The academic explanation is predictable: religious symbolism, shamanic ritual, mythological beings. The figurines represent gods or spirits, not actual creatures. The elongated heads might symbolize wisdom or divine knowledge. The reptilian features might connect to water deities, since reptiles and amphibians were associated with rivers and fertility in ancient Mesopotamian religion. It is all very reasonable, very scholarly, very safe. But here is what troubles me about that explanation. These figurines are found in domestic contexts, not just temples. They are buried with ordinary people, not just priests or rulers. They are depicted doing mundane activities like holding children, sitting, standing, working. If these were meant to represent distant, powerful gods, why portray them in such intimate, everyday scenarios? Why show them nursing babies? Why include them in family graves as if they were part of the community? And there is another detail that nobody seems to want to address directly. Many of these figurines are female, and they are clearly shown in childbirth or nursing positions. They have exaggerated hips and breasts, indicating fertility and motherhood. But the infants they hold, the children they nurse, are often depicted as human, not reptilian. What are we looking at here? Symbolism of divine mothers nurturing humanity, or something more literal, more biological, more unsettling? The Ubaid figurines bear a striking resemblance to descriptions that would appear in later Sumerian texts. The Anunnaki, the gods who descended from the heavens, are sometimes described with features that do not quite match human anatomy. References to their appearance are vague, but there are hints of something different, something that required the humans who saw them to struggle with how to describe what they were looking at. The Sumerian word for the Anunnaki includes the element An, meaning sky or heaven, and Ki, meaning earth. Those who from heaven to earth came, but another reading of the word emphasizes Anak, which in related Semitic languages connects to the concept of the neck or the long-necked ones. Could the Ubaid people have been depicting the same beings that the Sumerians would later call the Anunnaki? Were these figurines representations of rulers, visitors, or perhaps even a different subspecies of human that existed alongside Homo sapiens in deep prehistory? I am not saying I know the answer. I am saying the question deserves more than the dismissive wave it usually receives in academic circles. What we can say with certainty is that the Ubaid culture revered these beings, whatever they were. The figurines are treated with care, buried with honor, placed in positions of importance. They were not depicting monsters or enemies. They were depicting something central to their worldview, something that mattered enough to recreate in clay again and again across thousands of years. And then we come to Eridu, the city that changes everything. Eridu, located in what is now southern Iraq, holds a unique place in Mesopotamian history. The Sumerians themselves considered it the first city, the place where kingship descended from heaven, the original seat of divine authority on earth. Their texts state explicitly that Eridu was the beginning, the foundation upon which all other cities were built, and for a long time, archaeologists assumed this was mythological, symbolic, the Sumerians picking an arbitrary spot and declaring it sacred to legitimize their own authority. Then they started digging, and what they found confirmed the Sumerian claim in ways nobody expected. The excavations at Eridu, conducted primarily in the 1940s and 50s, revealed 19 distinct temple layers built one on top of another over thousands of years. The oldest of these temples dates to 5400 before the Common Era, that is 7400 years ago, nearly 2000 years before the Sumerians existed. And this was not a primitive structure. It was a well-planned building with clear religious purpose, decorated walls, offering tables, and a layout that would remain consistent through all subsequent rebuilding efforts. Think about what that means. For nearly 2000 years, people kept coming back to this exact spot, tearing down the old temple when it decayed, and building a new one in precisely the same location with the same architectural plan, generation after generation, century after century, maintaining a religious tradition at this specific site. Why? What was so important about this place? What made Eridu the beginning? The Sumerian texts offer an explanation. Eridu was the home of Enki, the god of wisdom, water, and creation. His temple was called the Abzu, the House of the Deep Waters, and it was built directly above a subterranean aquifer. Even today, if you visit the ruins of Eridu, you can see that the ancient temple platforms were constructed over a natural underground water source. This was not an accident. The entire city was positioned to take advantage of this specific geological feature. Now, ancient cultures building temples over water sources is not unusual. Water equals life, and sacred springs appear in religions worldwide. But the precision with which Eridu was located suggests knowledge of underground hydrology that should not have existed. Someone understood that there was an aquifer beneath this specific spot. Someone knew how to find it, and someone decided that this knowledge was important enough to build the first city around it. The Ubaid people built the earliest temples at Eridu. They established the religious traditions there. They chose that location and sanctified it long before the Sumerians arrived, which means the knowledge of that aquifer, the understanding of why that spot mattered, came from them, or came to them from whoever taught them. And then, around 4000 before the Common Era, something happened. The Ubaid culture began to fade. Not suddenly, not catastrophically, but gradually. Sites were abandoned, pottery styles changed. The distinctive Ubaid cultural markers disappeared from the archaeological record, replaced over several centuries by what we recognize as early Sumerian culture. Archaeologists call this a cultural transition, a peaceful blending of peoples. But the truth is, we have no idea what happened. We do not know if the Ubaid people were absorbed, replaced, or simply evolved into what became the Sumerians. There is a gap, a period of maybe 500 to 1,000 years, where the record becomes muddy and unclear. And when clarity returns, when we see the rise of true Sumerian city-states around 3200 before the Common Era, we find them building on Ubaid foundations, literally and metaphorically. They are using the same temple sites, the same architectural plans, the same irrigation techniques. But now they have added writing, more complex political structures, and those mysterious texts about antediluvian kings and gods descending from heaven. The Ubaid culture is not a footnote. It is the foundation, the shadow that every subsequent Mesopotamian civilization was built upon. And the questions it raises, about continuity, about knowledge transfer, about those strange figurines with their reptilian faces and elongated skulls, do not have comfortable answers. They have implications that reach far beyond archaeology into the realm of who we are and where we really came from. There is a clay tablet sitting in the British Museum right now, catalogued as WB62, and most people will never hear about it. It will not appear in documentaries about ancient Mesopotamia. It will not be featured in museum exhibitions about the birth of civilization. School textbooks will not mention its existence. Yet this single artifact, no larger than a smartphone, contains information that fundamentally challenges our understanding of human history. It is a list, a roster of names, 7 names, to be precise. 7 beings described as the Apkallu, the sages of prehistory, the teachers of forbidden knowledge who walked among humans in the time before the flood. According to the text inscribed on WB62, these 7 Apkallu were not human, not entirely. Anyway, the tablet describes them as appearing from the sea, fish-like in appearance, possessing wisdom that no mortal could have acquired naturally. They taught humanity the arts of civilization, writing, mathematics, agriculture, metalworking, architecture, astronomy, law. Everything that separates civilization from savagery, these beings delivered it, fully formed, to primitive humans who were supposedly still figuring out how to plant seeds and stack mud bricks. The first of these sages was named Adapa. His name appears repeatedly in Sumerian literature, always associated with the city of Eridu, always connected to the god Enki. Another was named Euana, though in later Babylonian texts he becomes Oannes, and Greek historians writing centuries after the fact still remembered him. The historian Berossus, writing in the 3rd century before the Common Era, recorded Babylonian traditions about Oannes, describing him as a creature with the body of a fish and the head of a man beneath the fish head, with human feet below the fish tail. During the day, Oannes would emerge from the Persian Gulf and teach humans various skills. At night, he would return to the ocean depths. Berossus claimed this being taught humans letters, sciences, and arts of every kind. He taught them to construct cities, to found temples, to compile laws. He taught them geometry. He showed them how to distinguish the seeds of the earth and how to collect fruits. In short, he instructed them in everything that could soften their manners and humanize their lives. Now, you can do 2 things with this information. You can file it under mythology, assume that ancient people created these stories to explain the mysterious origins of their own advanced knowledge, and move on with your day. Or you can pause and ask yourself why cultures separated by thousands of miles and thousands of years all tell versions of the same story. Why do the Sumerians speak of 7 sages emerging from the sea? Why do the Babylonians maintain this tradition centuries later? Why does the Greek Berossus, working from Babylonian temple archives, record these accounts as historical fact rather than religious allegory? And why do the Dogon people of West Africa tell stories about the Nommo, amphibious beings from the star system Sirius, who came to Earth to teach humanity? The pattern is too consistent to dismiss. Something happened, someone taught, and the memory of that teaching persisted across civilizations, each culture preserving the story in their own way, adding their own cultural details, but maintaining the core narrative. Knowledge came from somewhere else, from beings who were not quite like us, from teachers who appeared, instructed, and then departed, leaving behind the tools of civilization. But WB62 is just the beginning. Let us talk about a document that makes modern historians deeply uncomfortable: the Sumerian King List. Multiple copies of this text exist, inscribed on clay prisms and tablets, the most complete being the Weld Blundell prism, held at the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford. This is not a fringe artifact. This is a mainstream, authenticated ancient document that every serious scholar of Mesopotamia must grapple with. And what it says is absolutely insane. The King List divides history into 2 epochs: before the flood and after the flood. After the flood, everything is relatively normal. Kings reign for reasonable periods: 6 years, 20 years, 36 years. The kind of reign lengths you would expect from mortal humans who age and die like everyone else. Occasionally someone rules for longer, but nothing that strains credibility. The post-flood section reads like a legitimate historical record, and indeed, many of the later kings mentioned in the list can be corroborated through other archaeological evidence. But before the flood, the numbers stop making sense. They do not just stretch believability, they shatter it completely. 8 kings ruling in 5 cities for a combined total of 241,200 years. Let me break that down for you. Alulim, the first king of Eridu, ruled for 28,800 years. His successor, Alalngar, managed 28,800 years as well, apparently setting some kind of standard. Down in Bad Tibira, Enmenluana reigned for 43,200 years. Dumuzi, the shepherd who would later become associated with death and resurrection mythology, held power for 36,000 years. These are not symbolic numbers. They are presented in the same matter-of-fact style as the post-flood kings. The text does not flag them as mythological. It does not offer any explanation or justification. It simply states them as historical fact. Modern scholars have attempted every possible explanation to make this reasonable. Maybe the numbers represent dynasties rather than individuals. Maybe the Sumerians used a different calendar system that we are misinterpreting. Maybe the base 60 mathematical system they used created conversion errors when later scribes tried to update the records. Maybe the long reigns are symbolic representations of golden ages or cultural memory compressed into singular figures. All of these theories have merit. All of them are attempts by intelligent people to rationalize something that does not fit our understanding of human biology and mortality. But here is what bothers me. The text itself acknowledges the flood as a dividing line. It explicitly states, "Then the flood swept over." After the flood had swept over, when kingship was lowered from heaven, kingship was in Kish. The authors knew they were describing 2 different eras. They understood that something fundamental changed. Before the flood, kings lived impossibly long. After the flood, they did not. That transition is marked, noted, treated as significant. Why would they do that if the numbers were merely symbolic? Why create that stark before and after if both periods were meant to be read the same way? Unless they were recording something real, something that actually happened, something about the pre-flood world that was genuinely different from the post-flood world in terms of human lifespan, biology, or the passage of time itself. I am not saying I know what that difference was. I am saying the Sumerians claimed there was a difference, and they documented it carefully. The Eridu Genesis provides more context. This tablet, composed around 1600 before the Common Era but clearly referencing much older traditions, tells the story of Ziusudra, the Sumerian Noah. The text is fragmentary. Parts are missing, destroyed by time and the fragility of clay. But what survives is remarkable. The gods, disturbed by the noise and overpopulation of humanity, decide to send a flood to wipe out civilization. Enki, always the friend of humanity, warns Ziusudra. He tells him to build a boat. Not just any boat. The instructions are specific. The dimensions are given. The construction materials are listed. Ziusudra follows these instructions exactly, loads the boat with animals and seeds, and survives the deluge that destroys everything else. When the waters recede, Ziusudra offers sacrifices to the gods, and they reward him with immortality and eternal life in Dilmun, a paradisical land to the east. The text concludes with the restoration of kingship, the rebuilding of cities, and the renewal of civilization. But now, everything is different. The connection to the divine is weaker. Humans live shorter lives. The golden age of the antediluvian world is gone, replaced by a harder, more mortal existence. Sound familiar? It should. This story predates the biblical flood narrative by at least 1,000 years, probably much more. Genesis, Exodus, the entire Hebrew tradition about Noah and the Ark, they are all drawing from this older Mesopotamian source. But the biblical account is simplified, monotheistic, moralized. The Sumerian version is more complex, more detailed, more technical. It reads less like a religious parable and more like a disaster survival manual preserved from a previous age. And here is the thing that keeps me up at night. There is geological evidence for massive flooding in Mesopotamia. Multiple flood layers have been found at Ur, at Kish, at Shuruppak. These are not minor seasonal floods. These are catastrophic sediment deposits indicating water levels that would have submerged entire cities. Dating these layers is complicated, but estimates place them between 5,000 and 4,000 before the Common Era, right in that murky transitional period between the Ubaid culture and the rise of Sumer. Something happened. The question is not whether there was a flood. The question is how bad it was, whether it was regional or global, and why it became the central trauma of Mesopotamian cultural memory. The Black Sea deluge hypothesis offers one possible explanation. Geological research by William Ryan and Walter Pittman suggests that around 5600 before the Common Era, the Black Sea was a freshwater lake sitting well below sea level. Then, due to rising ocean levels at the end of the Ice Age, the Mediterranean breached the Bosphorus Strait. Salt water poured into the Black Sea basin at a rate of 40 cubic miles per day, raising water levels by hundreds of feet and flooding thousands of square miles of inhabited coastline. If humans were living around the shores of the Black Sea at that time, and we know they were, this event would have been apocalyptic, an entire world swallowed by rising waters. Coastal settlements, farmland, hunting grounds, all disappearing beneath the waves in a matter of weeks or months. The survivors would have fled in all directions, carrying with them stories of the deluge, stories that would be told and retold for thousands of years until they became the foundation myths of multiple cultures. But whether the flood was the Black Sea event, a Mesopotamian regional catastrophe, or something else entirely, the Sumerian texts preserve a memory of what came before. They describe antediluvian cities with names and locations. They list kings who ruled those cities. They detail the knowledge systems those civilizations possessed. And they claim, repeatedly and consistently, that after the flood, humanity had to rebuild from scratch, relearning what had been lost, recovering fragments of ancient wisdom. This brings us to the concept of the me. This is one of the most fascinating ideas in Sumerian theology, and it barely gets mentioned in mainstream discussions of ancient religion. The me were divine decrees, fundamental laws that governed reality, but they were also something more tangible. They were objects, or perhaps data, that could be possessed, stolen, transferred. The famous poem Inanna and the God of Wisdom describes how the goddess Inanna travels to Eridu and gets the god Enki drunk. While he is intoxicated, she tricks him into giving her the me, and she loads them onto her boat and sails away before he sobers up and realizes what he has done. The poem then lists the me she stole, and this is where it gets interesting. The list includes abstract concepts like kingship, justice, and victory, but it also includes very specific, practical knowledge: the art of metalworking, the art of writing, the art of woodworking, masonry, leatherworking, the various musical instruments, the art of copulation, the art of prostitution, warfare, counseling, judgment, the giving of legal decisions. It is a comprehensive catalogue of everything that makes civilization function. Why would divine knowledge be itemized like a shopping list? Why describe it as something that can be physically transported from one place to another? Unless the Sumerians were preserving a memory of actual knowledge transfer. Unless the me represented something real, perhaps repositories of information, perhaps teaching materials, perhaps even technology that could be handed down from one generation to the next. or stolen by rivals seeking to advance their own cities. Enki, the god most associated with the me, is always portrayed as the keeper of forbidden knowledge. He is the one who warns Yusudra about the flood. He is the one who gives humans the gifts of civilization. He is described in texts as dwelling in the Abzu, the underground ocean of fresh water that the Sumerians believed existed beneath the earth. His temple at Eridu, the Abzu, was built directly over that subterranean aquifer. Was this purely symbolic? A religious connection between water and wisdom? Or was there something about that location, something about the underground water system, that made it an ideal place to store knowledge, to preserve records, to maintain continuity across catastrophic events like floods? I keep coming back to the idea of preservation. Everything about these texts suggests a culture desperately trying to remember. The Sumerian king list is not just a historical document, it is an act of memory preservation. Someone compiled it, carefully listing every king, every reign length, every city, because they did not want that information to disappear. The Eridu Genesis is not just a flood story. It is a survival manual embedded in mythology, instructions for how to prepare for catastrophe and rebuild afterward. The concept of the me is not just theology. It is a framework for thinking about knowledge as something precious, transferable, and potentially recoverable after disaster. These tablets are not religious texts in the way we usually understand that term. They are archives, attempts to document a history that was already ancient when the Sumerians wrote it down. And the fact that mainstream academia treats them as primitive mythology rather than historical testimony says more about our own biases than it does about the reliability of the sources. We assume that ancient people were superstitious and naive, incapable of distinguishing fact from fiction. But what if they were better historians than we give them credit for? What if they were recording exactly what they believed happened, based on evidence and traditions that have not survived to our time? The tablets exist. WB62 exists. The king list exists. The Eridu Genesis exists. They are real artifacts, physically present in museums, available to anyone who wants to read them. The question is not whether they are genuine. The question is whether we are brave enough to take them seriously. If the story ended in Mesopotamia, we could write it off as regional mythology, one culture's attempt to explain their origins through tales of ancient kings and civilizations lost beneath floodwaters. But the story does not end there, not even close, because once you start looking, once you train your eyes to see the pattern, you find it everywhere, on every continent, in cultures that supposedly never contacted each other, separated by oceans and millennia, yet all telling variations of the same impossible story. There was something before, something sophisticated, something that was destroyed. And what we call the beginning of civilization is actually just the aftermath. The slow recovery from a catastrophe so complete that it nearly erased all evidence of what came before. Let me take you to southeastern Turkey, to a hilltop called Göbekli Tepe. The name means belly hill in Turkish, and for thousands of years, it was just another mound in a landscape full of archaeological mounds. Then in 1994, a German archaeologist named Klaus Schmidt decided to actually excavate it. What he found changed everything we thought we knew about the capabilities of prehistoric humans. Göbekli Tepe is a megalithic complex consisting of massive T-shaped limestone pillars arranged in circular enclosures. The pillars weigh up to 20 tons each. They are covered in intricate carvings of animals, abstract symbols, and humanoid figures. The craftsmanship is extraordinary. We are talking about detailed three-dimensional reliefs carved into hard limestone using stone tools. Lions, foxes, scorpions, vultures, snakes, bulls, all rendered with an artistic sophistication that suggests professional sculptors, specialized labor, and a culture wealthy enough to support artists who did nothing but create monumental art. The site has been radiocarbon dated to 9600 before the Common Era, 11,600 years ago. That makes it 6,000 years older than Stonehenge, 7,000 years older than the Egyptian pyramids, and 6,000 years older than the earliest Sumerian cities. According to everything we have been taught about human development, the people who built Göbekli Tepe should not have existed. They were supposed to be hunter-gatherers, small nomadic bands following animal herds and gathering wild plants. They were not supposed to have the organizational capacity to quarry, transport, and erect 20-ton stone pillars. They were not supposed to have the cultural complexity to create standardized religious architecture. They were not supposed to exist at all. Yet there it is. 20-plus circular enclosures identified so far, and ground-penetrating radar suggests there are many more still buried. Schmidt estimated that only about 5% of the site has been excavated. The rest remains underground, deliberately buried. And that is perhaps the strangest part of the entire mystery. Around 8,000 before the Common Era, someone carefully filled in the entire complex with soil and debris. They did not abandon it. They did not let it decay naturally. They buried it intentionally, preserving it like a time capsule, then walked away. Why would you do that? Why spend generations building something so monumental, only to bury it and hide it from the world? Schmidt believed it was an act of preservation, a way to protect something sacred during a time of crisis. But what crisis? What could make an entire civilization decide their greatest religious site needed to be hidden? The astronomical alignments at Göbekli Tepe offer a clue. Researchers have discovered that several of the pillars and enclosures align with specific stars and constellations, particularly the belt stars of Orion and the position of Sirius. But these alignments are not correct for the present day. They are correct for the sky, as it appeared around 10,900 before the Common Era, accounting for the slow wobble of Earth's axis called precession. The builders were either mapping the sky of their own time with extraordinary precision, or they were recreating the sky of an even earlier period, commemorating something that had happened before they built the site. And there is more. One of the pillars, pillar 43 inches, enclosure D, shows what appears to be a cosmological scene, a vulture, a scorpion, and various other animals arranged in ways that match specific constellations. Some researchers, most notably Martin Sweatman and Dimitrios Tsikritsis, have argued that this pillar depicts a cometary impact event. The arrangement of symbols, when interpreted as a star map, points to a date around 10,950 before the Common Era, right at the beginning of an abrupt climate shift called the Younger Dryas impact event. Let us talk about the Younger Dryas, because it is the missing piece that connects all of these mysteries. Around 12,800 years ago, Earth's climate was warming nicely as the last ice age ended. Then suddenly, catastrophically, temperatures plunged again. The warming stopped. Glaciers that had been retreating started advancing. Megafauna across North America, mammoths, mastodons, giant sloths, saber-toothed cats, all went extinct within a very short period. The Clovis culture, the dominant human culture in North America at the time, vanished from the archaeological record. Something devastating happened, and it happened fast. For decades, scientists could not figure out what caused the Younger Dryas. Then, evidence started accumulating. A thin layer in the geological record dating to 12,800 years ago contains unusual materials, platinum at concentrations far higher than normal, nanodiamonds, which only form under extreme pressure and heat, microscopic spherules, tiny balls of melted rock, carbon spherules indicating massive wildfires. All of this points to one conclusion: impact. Something from space, probably a fragmented comet, slammed into Earth's atmosphere and surface, triggering wildfires, climate disruption, and mass extinction. The impact hypothesis is still debated, but the evidence keeps mounting. Impact proxies have been found at dozens of sites across multiple continents, all dating to the same narrow time window. And if you map the likely impact zones, they cluster around the North American ice sheet and possibly the northern Atlantic Ocean. An object or objects hitting the ice sheet would have vaporized massive amounts of ice, flooding the Atlantic with fresh water, disrupting ocean currents, and triggering the climate shift that defines the Younger Dryas. Now, here is the connection. If there were advanced cultures around 12,800 years ago, cultures sophisticated enough to build sites like Göbekli Tepe, then this impact event would have been apocalyptic for them. Coastal settlements would have been destroyed by tsunamis. Climate disruption would have collapsed food systems. The societal chaos that followed would have erased most evidence of their existence. The survivors would have retreated to high ground, preserved what knowledge they could, and slowly, painfully, rebuilt over thousands of years. Göbekli Tepe might be that act of rebuilding, or it might be that act of preservation before the final collapse. Either way, it is evidence of human sophistication far earlier than we have been willing to admit. And it is not alone. Let me take you underwater, because some of the most compelling evidence for lost civilizations is currently sitting beneath hundreds of feet of ocean. At the end of the last ice age, sea levels were approximately 120 meters lower than they are today. That is almost 400 feet. Coastlines extended miles beyond their current positions. River valleys that are now submerged were fertile plains, and humans, like humans everywhere, preferred to live near water, which means the coastal settlements where advanced cultures would have thrived are now underwater, inaccessible to normal archaeological methods, preserved in marine sediment, where very few researchers have the resources or inclination to look. Off the coast of Gujarat in western India lies the submerged city of Dwarka. Sonar surveys and underwater excavations have revealed extensive stone structures, walls, and geometric patterns on the seabed. The structures extend over several square miles. Carbon dating of artifacts recovered from the site suggests occupation dating back to 7500 before the Common Era, possibly earlier. Ancient Indian texts describe Dwarka as a magnificent city built by Krishna, a city that was swallowed by the sea after Krishna's death. For centuries, this was considered pure mythology. Then, marine archaeologists found the ruins exactly where the texts said they would be. Off the southern coast of Japan lies the Yonaguni Monument, a massive underwater formation of stone that has sparked decades of debate. The structure features parallel edges, right angles, and what appear to be carved steps and platforms. Mainstream geologists argue it is a natural formation shaped by tectonic activity and erosion, but the geometric precision is unsettling. Natural processes rarely create such consistent 90-degree angles and flat surfaces. The structure has been dated geologically to at least 10,000 years old, based on when that section of coastline was last above water. If it is artificial, if it was carved by humans, then it represents sophisticated stone working in a period when humans were supposedly living in small hunting bands. The debate continues, but what is not debatable is that sea level rise at the end of the Ice Age flooded thousands of square miles of inhabited land. The continental shelves, the shallow underwater extensions of every continent, were exposed land during the Ice Age. People lived there, they built there, and when the ice melted, when sea levels rose those 400 feet over several thousand years, all of it vanished beneath the waves. We have been doing archaeology on the remnants, on the high ground that stayed dry, and declaring that we understand ancient history. But we have been looking in the wrong place. The real evidence, the coastal cities where population would have been densest and culture most advanced, are all underwater. Think about what that means. We have no idea what civilizations existed on those now submerged coastlines. We have no access to their settlements, their architecture, their technology. The archaeological record we base all our conclusions on is fundamentally incomplete because we have been unable to excavate the places where humans actually lived during the Ice Age. It is like trying to understand modern civilization by only looking at mountain villages while ignoring every coastal city. You would get a completely distorted picture of human capability and culture. And then there are the myths. Every culture with a coastline has flood stories. The Mesopotamian deluge we have already discussed, the biblical Noah, but also the Greek story of Deucalion and Pyrrha, the Hindu tale of Manu and the Great Fish, the Aztec legend of the fourth sun ending in flood, the Aboriginal Australian stories of the ocean rising and swallowing the land, the Native American legends of the earth being covered with water, the Chinese story of Gun Yu and the Great Flood, Polynesian traditions about islands sinking beneath the sea. These are not isolated myths, they are global. Cultures separated by entire oceans, cultures with no contact until modern times, all preserving stories of the world being inundated, of civilizations being destroyed, of survivors rebuilding. The standard academic response is that floods are common, that most cultures live near water, and therefore flood myths are natural and do not indicate a single global event. But the similarity of details is striking. The warning from a deity, the building of a boat, the survival of a chosen family or group, the preservation of animals and seeds, the emergence into a different world after the waters recede. These specific narrative elements repeat across cultures in ways that suggest either common experience or very ancient cultural exchange. What if these are not religious allegories? What if they are cultural memories, passed down through oral tradition, preserving the trauma of watching the world drown? The sea level rise at the end of the Ice Age was not a single event. It happened in pulses over thousands of years. There were periods of rapid rise triggered by glacial collapses. There were superflows, massive outbursts of meltwater that would have raised sea levels noticeably within a human lifetime. If you were living on the coast in 8000 before the Common Era, and you saw the shoreline advancing year after year, swallowing villages and farmland, you would tell your children. They would tell their children. The story would persist for millennia as a warning, a memory of when the gods sent water to punish humanity. Göbekli Tepe was buried around 8000 before the Common Era, right when sea levels were still rising from Ice Age melt. right when coastal populations would have been under maximum stress, right when someone might decide that preserving their most sacred site for a future generation was more important than continuing to use it. The pattern is global because the catastrophe was global. Climate disruption, sea level rise, possible impact events, megafauna extinction, cultural collapse, and in the aftermath, the survivors rebuilt what they could remember, codified it in mythology and religion, and started over. What we call the first civilizations, Sumer, Egypt, the Indus Valley, these were not the beginning, they were the recovery, the second attempt, the rebuilding of something that had existed before and had been lost. The evidence is scattered across the globe, underwater and underground, in texts and in stones, waiting for us to stop dismissing it as primitive superstition and start treating it as testimony from survivors of a world we have forgotten. Here is where the story gets complicated, where archaeology meets mythology meets something we do not have a good word for yet. Because after establishing that advanced pre-flood civilizations likely existed, after acknowledging that something catastrophic destroyed them, after recognizing that the Sumerians were inheriting knowledge rather than inventing it, we have to confront the most uncomfortable question of all. Where did the Sumerians say that knowledge came from? Who did they claim taught them? And why does their answer sound less like religion and more like a contact report? The Anunnaki. The name appears in thousands of cuneiform texts spanning millennia. In Sumerian, the word breaks down into components, and meaning sky or heaven, ki meaning earth, the joining element na indicating movement or descent. Various scholars translate it as those who from heaven came, princely offspring, or those of royal blood. But the consistent thread through all Sumerian references is clear. These were beings who came from somewhere else, who possessed knowledge and power far beyond normal humans, and who played a direct, hands-on role in the development of human civilization. The texts describe their arrival as occurring 432,000 years ago, not 432 years, not 4,320 years, 432,000 years. That number appears repeatedly in different sources, calculated using the Sumerian base 60 mathematical system. Now, to be absolutely clear, there is no archaeological evidence of any civilization existing 432,000 years ago. That date falls into the Middle Pleistocene, a period when anatomically modern humans had not even evolved yet. So either the Sumerians were wildly wrong about their own chronology, or they were measuring something different than we understand. But set aside the numbers for a moment and focus on the narrative. The story goes like this. The Anunnaki descend to Earth. 7 primary figures establish the first settlements. They choose specific locations based on criteria we are not entirely clear about, though water sources and geographic positioning seem important. Eridu is founded first, then Bad Tibira, then Larak, Sippar, and Shurupak. These become centers of knowledge, technology, and culture. The Anunnaki teach humans the fundamentals of civilization: agriculture, irrigation, metallurgy, writing, mathematics, astronomy, law, medicine. Everything appears not through gradual human innovation, but through instruction from these beings. And here is where it gets strange. The Anunnaki are not portrayed as distant, abstract gods. They are physical. They eat, they drink, they have conflicts and politics among themselves, they form relationships with humans, they establish hierarchical structures with clear roles and responsibilities. The texts describe their residences, their temple complexes, their travels between cities. They are written about the way you would write about foreign diplomats or colonizers, not the way you write about invisible spiritual forces. Enki, the god of wisdom and fresh water, is consistently portrayed as the friend of humanity. He is the one who warns Ziusudra about the coming flood. He is the one who teaches the arts of civilization. He is the keeper of the Me, those divine decrees that contain all knowledge. His symbol is 2 serpents intertwined, which later cultures would adopt as the caduceus, the symbol of medicine. His temple at Eridu, the Abzu, sits over the underground aquifer, and texts describe him dwelling in the depths, in the Abzu, the primordial waters beneath the earth. Why would a god need a specific physical location tied to a geological feature unless there was something tangible about his presence there? Enlil, brother and rival to Enki, is the god of wind and storms, the administrator, the enforcer of divine will. He is based in Nippur, the religious center of Sumer. While Enki favors humanity, Enlil often seems suspicious of human potential and willing to limit human development. When humans become too numerous and too loud, It is Enlil who proposes the flood to wipe them out. When Enki saves humanity by warning Ziusudra, Enlil is furious, though he eventually accepts the outcome. These are not the actions of omnipotent, transcendent deities. These are the actions of powerful beings with competing agendas, operating within constraints, making decisions based on circumstances. They argue, they compromise, they make mistakes. The texts portray them almost as administrators of a colonial project, dealing with the complexities of managing a developing civilization while pursuing their own objectives. And what were those objectives? The texts provide an answer, though it is one that modern readers find difficult to take seriously. According to the Atrahasis epic, one of the most complete Mesopotamian creation myths, the Anunnaki came to Earth to extract resources, specifically gold and other minerals. But the work was hard, the conditions difficult. The rank-and-file Anunnaki, called the Igigi, were assigned to the mines. They labored for thousands of years, and eventually, they rebelled. They threw down their tools, surrounded Enlil's residence, and demanded relief from their toil. The leadership convenes to address the crisis. They need workers, but the Igigi refuse to continue. Enki proposes a solution. Create a new worker. Take a primitive hominid species already present on Earth and upgrade it. Enhance its intelligence and capabilities to the point where it can perform the necessary labor. Mix the clay of the Earth, the biological material of the existing creature, with the essence of the gods, whatever that means. The result is the Adapa, the model human, the first of a new kind of worker species that will serve the Anunnaki and allow the Igigi to be relieved of mining duties. Now, you can read that as pure mythology. Gods creating humans from clay is a common motif in ancient religions worldwide, but the specific details in the Mesopotamian version are unsettling. The text describes Enki and the mother goddess Ninhursag working together on this project. They perform experiments. There are failures, beings created with defects who cannot survive. They adjust their methods. Eventually, they succeed, creating 7 males and 7 females who become the templates for humanity. The language used is procedural, almost clinical, describing a process of trial and error that sounds more like genetic engineering than divine magic. Zecharia Sitchin built his entire controversial theory on this foundation. He argued that the Anunnaki were extraterrestrial visitors from a planet called Nibiru, that they came to Earth seeking gold for atmospheric purposes, that they genetically modified Homo erectus, or another hominid species, to create Homo sapiens as a worker race, and that all of human civilization is the result of this intervention. Mainstream scholars have thoroughly demolished Sitchin's Sumerian translations, pointing out errors, misreadings, and outright fabrications in his work. His astronomical claims about Nibiru do not hold up to scientific scrutiny. His timelines are confused. His conclusions are sensationalist. But here is the problem. Even if Sitchin got the details wrong, even if his translations were flawed and his theories overreaching, he was responding to something real in the texts. The Sumerians did describe creation as a process involving the mixing of divine and earthly elements. They did portray the Anunnaki as physical beings with technological capabilities. They did preserve stories of humans being created to serve as workers. These elements exist in the source material. The question is not whether Sitchin made things up. The question is what those source materials actually mean. Let me give you another translation. This one from the Sumerian text describing Adapa. Enki created him as a protecting spirit among mankind, a sage whose command no one can oppose. The sage from Eridu, Enki, created Adapa among mankind as a protecting spirit for them. Wide understanding he had perfected for him to disclose the designs of the land. This is describing someone who did not evolve naturally, who was created with purpose, who was given enhanced cognitive abilities specifically to understand complex systems. That reads less like mythological poetry and more like a project report. And then there are the descriptions of the Anunnaki themselves, their appearance, their technology, the way they moved between locations. The Sumerian word for temple is which literally means house. The temples were not just symbolic structures, they were residences, physical dwellings where the gods actually lived. Each major Anunnaki figure had a specific city and temple. Enki had the Abzu in Eridu, Enlil had the Kur in Nippur, Inanna had the Anna in Uruk. These structures were maintained by priests who brought food offerings, performed rituals, and managed the god's household as if the deity were physically present and needed material sustenance. The gods travelled. They used vehicles described as skyboats or flying chambers. The texts mention Enki traveling in his boat of heaven, which could move across both water and sky. Inanna is described as riding in her boat of An, traveling to visit Enki in Eridu, later flying to Uruk with the stolen me. These are not metaphorical journeys. The texts describe travel times, destinations, and physical movement through space. If you wanted to describe advanced transportation technology to a Bronze Age audience with no reference for anything beyond boats and wagons, would it not sound exactly like this? Flying chambers, skyboats, vehicles that move through heaven. The symbol of the Anunnaki, appearing on cylinder seals and temple reliefs, is the din, gear, sometimes rendered as a winged disc, sometimes as a rocket-like column, sometimes as a stepped structure suggesting a ziggurat or launch platform. The iconography is consistent across thousands of artifacts. Whatever the din, gear, represents, it was important enough to become the standard symbol for divinity itself. The Sumerian word dingir means god, but its pictographic origin shows a star or radiant object, suggesting connection to the sky or celestial phenomena. I am not telling you that ancient aliens built civilization. I am not claiming to know what the Anunnaki actually were. What I am saying is that the Sumerian texts describe contact. They describe beings who came from elsewhere, who possessed advanced knowledge and technology, who intervened directly in human development, and who were remembered not as myths, but as historical figures who walked the earth and shaped the course of human events. Whether those beings were extraterrestrial visitors, survivors from an advanced pre-flood human civilization, a now extinct hominid species, or something else entirely, the pattern is clear. The Sumerians did not see themselves as the originators of their civilization. They saw themselves as students, inheritors, and sometimes servants of powers that existed before them and beyond them. Their entire culture was built on the foundation of revealed knowledge, of wisdom passed down from the Anunnaki to humanity through the seven sages, the Apkallu, who emerged from the sea to teach. And maybe that is the real answer. Maybe gods is just the word they used for teachers. Maybe the Anunnaki were not supernatural beings but representatives of an older civilization, preserving knowledge through a dark age, rebuilding human society after catastrophe, passing on what they could before they themselves faded into legend. Contact does not have to mean spaceships. It can mean cultural transmission across time, knowledge keepers preserving the wisdom of a lost world and seeding it into the next generation of human civilization. But either way, the Sumerians were clear. They did not do it alone. Someone helped. Someone taught. And when those teachers departed, humanity was left with the tools of civilization and the responsibility to remember where those tools came from. We are still trying to figure out if we have remembered correctly. Let me tell you about a problem that nobody wants to talk about. Right now, sitting in the basement storage facilities of the British Museum in London, there are approximately 130,000 cuneiform tablets, clay documents from ancient Mesopotamia, letters, contracts, religious texts, historical records, scientific observations, literary works, an entire civilization's written output preserved in fired clay that has survived for thousands of years. These tablets represent the most complete archive of any ancient culture we have access to. We should know more about the Sumerians, Babylonians, and Assyrians than we know about medieval Europe. We should have translated every word, published every text, made the entire corpus available to researchers worldwide. Except we have not even close. As of today, only about 25% of those tablets have been fully translated and published. That means roughly 100,000 documents are sitting in storage, catalogued with numbers, photographed perhaps, but not translated, not analyzed, not made available to the broader academic community or the public. 100,000 voices from the ancient world, silent because nobody has bothered to listen to what they have to say. Why? The official explanation is resources. Translating cuneiform is difficult, time-consuming work that requires years of specialized training. There are only a few hundred scholars in the world qualified to do it professionally. Universities do not fund Assyriology departments the way they fund STEM research. Grants are limited. Academic positions are scarce. It is a small field with a massive backlog, and they are working through it as fast as they can given the constraints. That is the charitable explanation. It might even be true for the majority of tablets, the mundane administrative records and grain receipts that make up the bulk of ancient archives. But what about the other tablets? The ones that deal with history, cosmology, science, technology, the ones that might contain information challenging to established narratives. Who decides which tablets get translated first? Who determines which texts are important enough to publish and which can sit in storage for another century? The selection process is not neutral. It cannot be. Every scholar brings biases, assumptions, and career incentives to their work. Publishing a tablet that confirms existing theories about Sumerian religion is safe. It advances your career. Publishing a tablet that contradicts mainstream chronology or suggests knowledge that should not exist in that time period is risky. It invites criticism. It marks you as fringe, and in a field as small as Assyriology, being marked as fringe can end your career before it begins. Let me give you a concrete example. The WB tablets, a collection housed at the British Museum, include numerous texts about the Apkallu, those 7 sages who supposedly taught humanity before the flood. Some of these tablets have been translated and published, others have not. The published ones focus on mythological narratives, ritual texts, things that fit comfortably into the category of religious belief. But researchers who have requested access to the untranslated WB tablets report being told they are not priority for translation, or that they are too fragmentary to be useful, or simply that access is restricted pending conservation work that never seems to be completed. What is on those tablets? We do not know. Maybe nothing controversial, maybe more ritual texts, or maybe descriptions of technology, detailed accounts of pre-flood civilizations, names and dates that would force us to rewrite everything. We will not know until someone translates them, and the people in control of access seem in no hurry to find out. Then there is the Iraq Museum looting of 2003. When American forces entered Baghdad during the invasion, the Iraq Museum was left unguarded. Over a period of several days, looters ransacked the building, stealing approximately 15,000 artifacts. Some were recovered, many were not. Among the stolen items were numerous cuneiform tablets, including some from pre-Sumerian periods. The Iraqi government published lists of missing items, desperate to track them down through international antiquities markets. Some tablets surfaced and were returned, but others vanished into private collections, black market sales, and destinations unknown. Here is what troubles me. The looting was not random. Witnesses and later investigations revealed that some looters had specific knowledge of what they were looking for. They bypassed display cases with visually impressive but historically mundane objects and went straight for storage areas containing tablets and cylinder seals. They used glass cutters and had keys to locked cabinets. This was not opportunistic theft by desperate civilians. This was targeted acquisition by people who knew exactly what they wanted and how valuable it was. Which tablets were taken? The published lists from the Iraq Museum identify some by catalogue number, but many entries are vague. 27 tablets from Ubaid period storage, 15 tablets from Antediluvian archive. We do not know what was on them. We do not know what information they contained. And now they are gone, either destroyed or locked away in the private vault of some collector who will never make them available to researchers. Convenient, is it not? The very tablets that might contain information about pre-Sumerian civilizations, stolen during the chaos of war, never to be examined by independent scholars. The academic gatekeeping goes deeper than just translation priorities. It exists in the peer review system, in funding decisions, in hiring committees, in conference invitations. Assyriology is a remarkably insular field. A small number of senior scholars control what gets published in major journals. They decide which PhD dissertations are acceptable and which are too controversial. They determine who gets hired for the few academic positions that exist. And they enforce an orthodox narrative about the ancient Near East that has remained largely unchanged since the early 20th century. That narrative goes like this. The Sumerians were the first civilization. They invented writing, mathematics, and urban planning through gradual indigenous development. Their religious texts are mythology, not history. Their descriptions of antediluvian civilizations are symbolic or corrupted oral traditions. The Anunnaki were gods, in the traditional sense, anthropomorphic representations of natural forces. Any interpretation that suggests the texts might be describing something literal, something physical, something that actually happened, is dismissed as pseudo-archaeology or ancient astronaut nonsense. Now, there have been scholars who challenged this narrative. People with legitimate credentials, proper training, and access to primary sources who looked at the evidence and said, "Wait, this does not add up. There are problems here that we need to address." What happened to them? Their careers stalled. Their papers were rejected from major journals. They were denied tenure. They were pushed out of academic institutions and forced to publish independently if they wanted to continue their research. I am not saying there is a conspiracy. I am saying there is a system, and that system protects itself. It rewards conformity and punishes deviation. It is not conscious malice. It is institutional inertia. When you have spent your entire career building a reputation on a particular interpretation of ancient Mesopotamia, you are not going to welcome someone who says your interpretation is fundamentally wrong. When your university department depends on maintaining good relationships with museums and funding bodies, you are not going to support research that might embarrass the institution or challenge powerful interests. And what about Zecharia Sitchin? Love him or hate him, he forced millions of people to actually think about what the Sumerian texts say, rather than just accepting academic summaries. Yes, his translations had errors. Yes, his astronomical claims about Nibiru do not hold up. Yes, he made speculative leaps that were not justified by the evidence, but the response from mainstream academia was not to engage with his arguments and correct his errors. It was to dismiss him entirely, to declare his work worthless, to tell the public that anyone who takes Sitchin seriously is a fool or a charlatan. That is not how scholarship is supposed to work. If someone makes translation errors, you publish the correct translations. If someone misinterprets a text, you explain the proper interpretation. If someone's theory is wrong, you demonstrate why with evidence and argument. You do not just wave your hand and declare the person unworthy of response. Unless, of course, you are afraid that engaging seriously with their claims might reveal uncomfortable truths about your own assumptions. Here is a question nobody wants to answer. If the mainstream interpretation of Sumerian texts is so obviously correct, why are scholars so defensive about alternative readings? If the evidence clearly supports the orthodox narrative, why the emotional reaction when someone questions it? Confidence does not need gatekeeping. Truth does not need protection from inquiry. The fact that alternative interpretations are treated not as wrong, but as dangerous, suggests there is something at stake beyond mere academic accuracy. Think about what it would mean if the Sumerians were telling the truth. If there really were advanced civilizations before the flood. If knowledge really was passed down from an earlier age. If the Anunnaki were not gods but something else, something that interacted physically with early humans, the implications cascade outward. Everything we teach about human origins needs revision. Every timeline gets rewritten. Every museum exhibit requires new labels. Every textbook becomes obsolete. Entire academic careers built on the current paradigm become irrelevant overnight. That is a lot to lose. That is a powerful incentive to maintain the status quo, to keep those 100,000 tablets in storage, to make sure that only safe interpretations see the light of day. I am not accusing individual scholars of deliberately hiding truth. Most of them are sincere, dedicated researchers doing their best within a constrained system. But the system itself has structural problems that bias it toward orthodoxy and away from paradigm-shifting discoveries. And it is not just academia. Religious institutions have their own interests in maintaining certain narratives about human origins and ancient history. If the Mesopotamian texts are accurate historical records, then the biblical account becomes derivative, a later adaptation of older stories. That challenges theological claims about divine revelation and scriptural uniqueness. Churches, mosques, and temples have spent 2,000 years building authority on the claim that their texts are special, uniquely inspired, fundamentally different from pagan mythology. Admitting that those texts borrowed heavily from Sumerian sources undermines that authority. The Vatican Library, for example, is estimated to contain over 75,000 codices and manuscripts, with 53 miles of shelving. Access is highly restricted. Researchers must apply years in advance, specify exactly which documents they want to see, and even then may be denied without explanation. We know the Vatican has Mesopotamian artifacts and texts acquired over centuries through various means. What do those texts say? We do not know. We are not allowed to know. The Vatican decides what gets made available and what remains sealed. I am not claiming the Vatican is hiding proof of ancient aliens or antediluvian civilizations. I am saying that institutions with theological interests control access to historical documents, and that creates an obvious conflict of interest. If a cuneiform tablet contradicts church doctrine about creation or human history, what incentive does the Vatican have to publish it? They can justify keeping it sealed for conservation reasons, for cultural sensitivity reasons, for 1,000 bureaucratic reasons that all amount to the same thing: control, information control. The pattern repeats across institutions, museums, universities, religious organizations, all sitting on archives of ancient texts, all controlling who gets access, all making decisions about what is important enough to translate and publish, and all of them, whether consciously or unconsciously, biased toward maintaining existing narratives rather than challenging them. So when someone asks, where is the evidence for advanced pre-flood civilizations? The honest answer is, we do not know, because the people who control access to the evidence have not looked or have not told us what they found. The absence of evidence is not evidence of absence when the evidence itself is locked away in institutional storage, untranslated, unpublished, unavailable to independent researchers who might ask uncomfortable questions. The truth might be in those 100,000 tablets, or it might not. But until we translate them all, until we make the entire archive available to anyone who wants to study it, until we remove institutional gatekeeping from the process of understanding our past, we will never know. And that should bother you far more than any theory about ancient aliens or lost civilizations, because what it means is that someone, somewhere, has decided that you are not allowed to know your own history. DNA does not lie. It cannot be influenced by academic politics or institutional bias. It sits in our cells, a chemical archive of everything that happened to our species, every evolutionary turn, every population bottleneck, every instance of interbreeding with other hominids. And when scientists started sequencing the human genome in earnest over the past few decades, they found things that do not quite fit the neat story we have been telling ourselves about human evolution. Anomalies, puzzles, genetic signatures that suggest our past is more complicated, stranger, and more mysterious than the textbooks admit. Let me start with something that sounds like science fiction but is established genetic fact: human chromosome 2. If you compare the human genome to the genomes of our closest relatives, chimpanzees and bonobos, you will notice something odd. Great apes have 24 pairs of chromosomes. Humans have 23. We are missing a pair, except we are not missing it. We fused it. At some point in our evolutionary past, two separate chromosomes merged end to end, creating the unusually large chromosome 2 that all modern humans carry. You can still see the evidence of this fusion. There are remnant centromeres, the attachment points where chromosomes connect during cell division, visible in the DNA sequence, like scars from ancient surgery. When did this happen? Genetic analysis suggests the fusion occurred somewhere between 700,000 and 1 million years ago, long before anatomically modern humans emerged. It is considered one of the key genetic events that separated our lineage from other great apes. The fusion is clean, functional, stable. It does not cause problems. In fact, it may have been advantageous, possibly affecting brain development or other traits that distinguish humans from apes. But here is the question nobody seems to want to ask loudly. Chromosome fusions are rare. They usually cause fertility problems or developmental issues. For a fusion to become fixed in a population, to spread until every single member carries it, requires very specific circumstances. Either the fusion happened in a small, isolated population that became the ancestors of all modern humans, or there was some selective pressure that made the fusion advantageous enough to overcome its initial disadvantages. Natural selection can explain it, but the precision, the cleanness of it, the fact that it became universal, makes you wonder if there is more to the story. Now, travel with me to South Africa, to a place called Mpumalanga province. There, scattered across the landscape, you will find thousands of circular stone ruins. Most are dismissed as cattle enclosures built by Bantu peoples in relatively recent history. But among these structures is one that researchers have claimed might be much, much older. It is called Adam's Calendar, though that name is more metaphor than archaeology. The stone circle consists of monolithic dolomite rocks arranged in a specific pattern. Trees growing through the structure have been carbon dated, suggesting the stones were placed at least 7,500 years ago, possibly much earlier. What makes this site controversial is the astronomical alignment. The stones mark the cardinal directions with precision. They align with the rise of specific stars, including Orion's belt, the same constellation that appears in the mythology and architecture of cultures worldwide. But the alignments are not correct for the present day. They are correct for a much earlier period, accounting for precession. Some researchers claim the original construction date could be as old as 75,000 to 160,000 years ago, based on these astronomical retrograde calculations. Mainstream archaeologists reject these dating claims, arguing that the site is a natural formation enhanced by more recent human activity. But the controversy reveals something important. There is evidence, disputed but present, of sophisticated astronomical knowledge in southern Africa far earlier than conventional timelines allow. And southern Africa is significant for another reason. It is where genetic evidence tells us modern humans first emerged. Mitochondrial Eve, the woman whose mitochondrial DNA lineage leads to all living humans, lived in sub-Saharan Africa approximately 150,000 to 200,000 years ago. Y-chromosomal Adam, the most recent common male ancestor of all living men, existed somewhere between 200,000 and 300,000 years ago. These were not the first humans, but they were the ancestors through whom all current human genetic lineages pass. Everyone alive today carries genetic material inherited from these individuals. But the interesting part is not just that they existed, it is when and where the human population experienced bottlenecks, dramatic reductions in numbers, that left genetic signatures we can still detect. Around 70,000 years ago, something happened that reduced the human population to perhaps as few as 10,000 individuals. The genetic evidence is clear. All humans alive today descend from the small group that survived whatever that event was. The leading candidate is the Toba supervolcanic eruption in Indonesia, which occurred approximately 74,000 years ago. The eruption released thousands of cubic kilometers of ash and sulfur into the atmosphere, triggering a volcanic winter that lasted years. Global temperatures dropped, food sources collapsed, species went extinct, and humanity nearly joined them. The survivors, clustered perhaps in southern Africa where conditions remained marginally survivable, became the ancestors of everyone who came after. We are all descended from whoever made it through that bottleneck. Now, here is where it connects to the genetic mysteries. If human populations were that small, that isolated, that stressed, it creates conditions where unusual genetic changes could become fixed rapidly. Small populations are where evolution happens fast. Genetic drift, the random change in gene frequencies, becomes powerful. Advantageous mutations spread quickly, disadvantageous ones disappear. If you wanted to, hypothetically, modify a species genetically, a population bottleneck is exactly when you would do it. Minimum individuals to alter, maximum impact on future generations. I am not saying that is what happened. I am saying the genetic evidence shows that humans went through a period where our entire species was reduced to a tiny, vulnerable population, and when we emerged from that bottleneck, we were different. Behaviorally, modern humans, with art, symbolism, complex tools, and advanced cognition, appear in the archaeological record shortly after the Toba event. Coincidence? Evolutionary pressure from surviving catastrophe? Or something else? And then there is the Neanderthal question. For over a century, we believed Neanderthals were an evolutionary dead end, a cousin species that went extinct without contributing to the modern human gene pool. Then we sequenced their genome, compared it to modern humans, and discovered something startling. Most people of European and Asian descent carry between 1 and 4% Neanderthal DNA. Africans, whose ancestors never left the continent, carry essentially none. This means there was interbreeding. Homo sapiens and Homo neanderthalensis were different enough to be considered separate species, yet similar enough to produce fertile offspring. And those hybrid children survived, reproduced, and passed on their mixed heritage. But Neanderthals are not the only other hominid we mated with. Denisovans, known primarily from fragmentary fossils found in a Siberian cave, contributed DNA to modern Melanesians, Aboriginal Australians, and Tibetan populations. Tibetans, in fact, carry a Denisovan gene variant that helps them survive at high altitudes, enabling efficient oxygen use in low-pressure environments. That gene did not come from Homo sapiens. It came from interbreeding with another species, and it was advantageous enough that natural selection preserved it. How many other hominid species did we encounter? How many contributed to our genome? Recent genetic studies suggest there might be ghost populations, hominid groups that are extinct and left no fossils, but whose DNA persists in modern humans through ancient interbreeding events. We are a hybrid species, carrying genetic contributions from multiple lineages, some of which we have not even identified yet. The Sumerian texts describe the creation of humans as a mixing process, divine essence combined with earthly clay, the template hominid upgraded to create a more capable worker. I am not claiming this is literal genetic engineering, but I am noting that our actual genetic history is a story of mixing, of different hominid populations encountering each other and producing hybrid offspring. If there were survivors of a more advanced pre-flood civilization, survivors who were human but perhaps genetically distinct, and they interbred with post-catastrophe populations, what signature would that leave in our DNA? We would see it as a population bottleneck. We would see it as unusual genetic variants that spread rapidly through small populations. We would see it as hybridization events with hominid lineages that seem closely related to us but distinct. We would see exactly what we do see when we look at human genetic history. A species that went through trauma, nearly died out, recovered, mixed with other populations, and emerged carrying genetic contributions from multiple sources. The genetic evidence does not prove ancient intervention, but it does not disprove it either. It shows that human history is more complicated than a simple evolutionary tree branching from ape ancestors to modern humans. It shows mixing, bottlenecks, rapid change, and mysteries we are only beginning to unravel. Our genome is an archive, and we are still learning how to read it properly. Every time we sequence another ancient bone, every time we compare genomes across populations, we find new surprises, new ghost populations, new interbreeding events, new evidence that who we are is the result of processes more complex than we ever imagined. So when the Sumerians said humanity was created through a mixing process, when they described beings from elsewhere contributing their essence to create us, maybe they were not entirely wrong. Maybe they were preserving a memory, filtered through mythology, of real genetic events, hybridization, population admixture, the combining of different lineages into something new. Whether those lineages were entirely natural, or whether some form of intervention occurred, the genetic signature would look similar. We are mixed. We are hybrids. We carry the legacy of multiple populations within our DNA. And until we fully understand what those populations were and how they contributed to making us who we are, we cannot dismiss the possibility that our origin story is stranger than we have been willing to accept. The code is written in our chromosomes. We just need the courage to read what it actually says rather than what we wish it said. Imagine you are an ancient astronomer. No telescopes, no computers, no photographs of the night sky, just your eyes, your patience, and the unchanging rotation of stars above you. Now, I want you to discover something that takes 25,920 years to complete a full cycle, something so slow that a human lifetime represents less than 0.5% of its total duration, something invisible to casual observation, detectable only through meticulous record-keeping across centuries. How would you even know it existed? Yet the Sumerians knew. They understood precession, the slow wobble of Earth's axis that causes the position of stars to shift gradually against the background of the seasons, the phenomenon that makes the North Star change over millennia, that causes the zodiac constellations to drift through the calendar, that creates what we call the Great Year, that 25,920-year cycle, after which the stars return to their original positions relative to the equinoxes. Modern astronomers discovered precession relatively recently. Hipparchus, the Greek astronomer, is credited with identifying it around 130 before the Common Era, though even he was working from Babylonian data inherited from earlier Mesopotamian observations. European science did not fully understand precession until the Renaissance. We needed centuries of recorded observations, mathematical models, and eventually telescopes to confirm what was happening. The movement is so subtle that you need at least 2,160 years of continuous, accurate star position data to detect a shift of one zodiacal age. To understand the full cycle, you need records spanning many multiples of that. So how did the Sumerians know? Their civilization, in its fully literate form, lasted maybe 1,500 years before transforming into Babylonian culture. That is not enough time to observe a complete precessional shift through direct measurement. Yet their astronomical texts, the MUL, A-pin tablets dated to around 1100 before the Common Era, but clearly copying older sources, demonstrate knowledge of precession. The tablets divide the ecliptic, the path the sun appears to trace through the sky, into 12 equal sections. The zodiac. They track the heliacal rising of specific stars, noting when certain constellations appear on the horizon just before sunrise, and they account for the slow drift of these positions over time. This is not primitive astrology. This is sophisticated mathematical astronomy that requires generational data collection and an understanding that celestial mechanics operate on timescales far beyond human experience. Where did they get this knowledge? The standard answer is that they inherited it from centuries of Babylonian observations, who inherited it from Sumerian priests, who inherited it from earlier astronomers going back into prehistory. Each generation adding to the accumulated knowledge, building a database of celestial positions that eventually became comprehensive enough to detect precession. But that explanation has a problem. It requires unbroken observational continuity across thousands of years, including through the catastrophic period we have been discussing, the flood events, the climate disruptions, the civilizational collapses. Astronomical knowledge is not like farming or pottery making. You cannot rediscover it through trial and error. You cannot figure out precession by accident. You need sustained, deliberate observation by specialists who understand what they are looking for and why it matters. If civilization collapsed, if there were dark ages where literacy was lost and cities abandoned, how did this specific, advanced astronomical knowledge survive intact, unless it was preserved intentionally? Unless someone, somewhere, during or before the catastrophe, recognized that this knowledge was too valuable to lose and took steps to record it, protect it, and pass it forward to whoever came after. The Sumerian astronomical texts might not be original observations. They might be copies of copies of copies, transcriptions of data collected by observers who lived thousands of years before Sumer existed as a civilization. Let me show you something specific. At the ancient city of Nibiru, archaeologists excavated a mathematical tablet that contains a number, not a measurement, not a date, just a number. 1,959,552, written in base 60 notation, preserved on fired clay, sitting in museum storage for decades before anyone bothered to ask what it represented. When mathematicians finally analyzed it, they realized it was a calculation, the number of days in a specific astronomical cycle. And when you do the conversion, when you work through the Sumerian sexagesimal mathematics, that number represents the precession of the equinoxes calculated to extraordinary precision. The Nibiru constant, as it is now called, is accurate to within a tiny fraction of modern measurements. We calculated the exact rate of precession using telescopes and atomic clocks in the 1950s. The Sumerians had the same number carved in clay 3,000 years before the Common Era. How? They did not have the observational tools to measure it that precisely. They did not have calculus or modern mathematical frameworks. Yet there it is, 1,959,552 days. The cosmic clock ticking in base 60 mathematics. Some scholars argue it is coincidence, that the number represents something else, and we are reading astronomical meaning into it retroactively. But the precision is too exact, the context too specific. The tablet is part of a mathematical series dealing with celestial cycles. This was not an accident. Someone calculated the rate of Earth's axial precession with near-modern accuracy and wrote it down for posterity. Now, let us talk about what they were watching. The Sumerians tracked not just stars but planets. They identified 5 visible planets beyond Earth: Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn. They knew these were different from stars, that they moved against the fixed background of constellations, that their movements followed patterns that could be predicted. They assigned each planet to a specific deity and tracked their positions obsessively. Why? For astrology, yes, but also because understanding planetary motion was crucial for their calendar system, for predicting agricultural seasons, for timing religious festivals. But here is what makes it weird. Sumerian astronomical texts also reference celestial bodies that should not have been visible to the naked eye. Uranus and Neptune are too dim to see without telescopes. Yet some researchers analyzing Sumerian cylinder seals and astronomical texts claim to find references to additional planetary bodies beyond Saturn. The most famous example is cylinder seal VA-243, held at the Vorderasiatisches Museum in Berlin. The seal shows a star surrounded by 11 smaller circles, which Sitchin interpreted as a diagram of the solar system, including all planets, plus the Sun and Moon. Mainstream scholars reject this interpretation, pointing out that the seal is damaged, that the number of dots is ambiguous, and that the context does not necessarily indicate a solar system diagram. Fair enough, but the question remains: how did the Sumerians develop such sophisticated astronomical knowledge? How did they know about precession? How did they calculate planetary cycles with accuracy that we only matched in the modern era? One possibility is time. Not their time, but someone else's time. If you had an advanced civilization observing the sky for 10,000 years, you would accumulate enough data to understand precession, to calculate orbital mechanics, to create comprehensive star catalogues. If that civilization was destroyed but managed to preserve some of their astronomical records, passing them to survivors or successor cultures, those records would appear as impossibly advanced knowledge to anyone who received them. The Sumerians might have been the inheritors, the scribes copying ancient data they did not fully understand but recognized as sacred and important. The MUL. Apin tablets are essentially astronomical handbooks. They list stars by constellation. They provide rising and setting times throughout the year. They include mathematical formulas for calculating lunar phases, planetary positions, and seasonal markers. These are practical documents meant for working astronomers and calendar keepers. But the sophistication of the mathematics, the comprehensiveness of the star catalogues, the accuracy of the calculations, all suggest a level of development that requires centuries of prior work. And here is something that should make you pause. The tablets describe the sky not as it appeared when they were written, but as it appeared roughly 2,000 years earlier, accounting for precession. Why would Babylonian astronomers in 1000 before the Common Era create star charts accurate for 3000 before the Common Era, unless they were not creating them, unless they were copying them from older sources and updating them, preserving ancient observations while adding their own? The division of the ecliptic into 12 equal parts, the zodiac, is itself mathematically sophisticated. It requires understanding that the sun's apparent path through the sky can be divided into geometrically equal sections, that each section can be assigned to a constellation, that this division is arbitrary but useful for tracking celestial positions over time. This is not obvious. It is not something you stumble upon casually. It represents a deliberate choice by astronomers who needed a standardized framework for recording and predicting celestial events. The zodiac is a technology, an information system for encoding astronomical data, and its invention required significant prior knowledge of how the heavens work. The Sumerians gave us this system, but they claim they received it from the Apkallu, those 7 sages who taught humanity the arts of civilization. Among those arts, explicitly listed in the texts, is the knowledge of the heavens, astronomy, astrology, the movements of celestial bodies, the cycles that govern time. If the Apkallu were preserving knowledge from an earlier civilization, astronomy would be one of the most important things to save, because astronomical knowledge proves itself. You can predict eclipses, you can calculate planetary positions years in advance, you can demonstrate mastery over time itself by showing that you understand the cosmic clock. And maybe that is exactly what they did. Maybe the Sumerian astronomical texts are not inventions, but inheritances, copies of observations made by astronomers who watched the sky from observatories we have not found, who recorded data we have not translated, who belonged to a civilization we have not acknowledged. The evidence sits in museum storage, the calculations inscribed in clay, the cosmic clock ticking in base 60 mathematics. All we have to do is take it seriously. All we have to do is ask how they knew what they should not have been able to know. And all we have to do is consider the possibility that someone, somewhere, a very long time ago, understood the universe better than we give them credit for. The stars do not lie. The mathematics do not lie. The precession continues, regardless of whether we acknowledge who first measured it. And the Sumerians, inheritors or inventors, left us a message written in astronomical constants. They understood the cosmic clock. The question is whether we understand what they were trying to tell us about who taught them to read it. Walk into any museum with a Mesopotamian collection and you will see bronze artifacts, swords, tools, decorative objects, statues of gods and kings. The labels will tell you these date to the Bronze Age, roughly 3300 to 1200 before the Common Era, and that bronze working represents a major technological advancement in human history. The transition from stone tools to metal changed everything. Agriculture became more efficient, warfare became more deadly, art became more refined. Civilization, as we understand it, required bronze. What the labels will not tell you is that bronze is not simple. It is not something you discover by accident. Bronze is an alloy, a mixture of copper and tin, typically in a ratio of about 90% copper to 10% tin. You have to mine both metals, often from different geographical locations. You have to smelt them separately, heating ore to temperatures exceeding 1,100 degrees Celsius to extract pure metal from rock. Then you have to combine them in precise proportions while molten, cast the mixture into molds, and allow it to cool in controlled conditions to achieve the desired hardness and workability. This is not a process you stumble into by throwing random rocks into a fire. Yet bronze appears in Mesopotamia around 3300 before the Common Era, without any archaeological evidence of an experimental phase, no failed attempts, no gradual refinement from crude early products to sophisticated later ones. The earliest bronze artifacts we find are already well made, properly alloyed, and produced in standardized forms. It is as if someone already knew the recipe and simply started producing bronze objects from day one. Where did that knowledge come from? The standard explanation is that bronze working developed gradually, but the evidence of early experimentation has not survived or has not been found. Copper smelting appears earlier, around 5000 before the Common Era, giving humans time to learn pyrotechnology before attempting alloys. Maybe bronze working developed in a region we have not excavated yet, and the technology diffused to Mesopotamia already perfected. These are reasonable hypotheses, but they require us to accept that a technology requiring precise temperature control, specific material ratios, and sophisticated metallurgical knowledge appeared fully formed in the archaeological record. And bronze is not the only example. Let me show you something stranger. Sitting in the Iraq Museum, or at least it was before the 2003 looting, there is an artifact called the Baghdad Battery. It was discovered in 1936 at Kujat Rabu, a site near Baghdad, in layers dating to the Parthian period, roughly 250 before the Common Era. The object consists of a clay jar about 5 inches tall containing a copper cylinder. Inside the copper cylinder is an iron rod. The copper cylinder is sealed at the bottom with bitumen, the natural asphalt that Mesopotamians used as waterproofing. When archaeologists examined it, they realized the design looked oddly functional. If you fill that jar with an acidic solution, vinegar or citrus juice, and insert the copper and iron components, you create a galvanic cell. An electrochemical reaction occurs between the two different metals in the acidic electrolyte, producing approximately 1 to 2 volts of electricity. Researchers have built replicas and confirmed that it works. The Baghdad battery produces measurable electric current. Now, Parthian civilization existed almost 2,000 years after the Sumerians, so this is not direct evidence of Sumerian technology. But the Parthians occupied the same region, built on the same sites, and likely inherited knowledge from earlier Mesopotamian cultures. If they had batteries in 250 before the Common Era, is it impossible that the technology originated earlier and was passed down through Babylonian and Assyrian intermediaries from an even older source? The conventional archaeological explanation is that the Baghdad battery was not actually a battery. It must have been used for something else, perhaps as a container for sacred scrolls, though that does not explain the iron rod or the careful sealing with bitumen. Or maybe it was used for electroplating, a technique for coating objects with thin layers of metal using electrical current. Some ancient artifacts show evidence of gilding that could potentially have been achieved through electroplating rather than mechanical methods. But here is the uncomfortable question. If ancient Mesopotamians understood electrochemistry well enough to create galvanic cells, what else did they understand? Electricity is not an obvious phenomenon. You do not stumble upon it. You need curiosity, experimentation, and a framework for understanding that chemical reactions can produce electrical effects. That suggests a culture of scientific inquiry, of testing hypotheses, of accumulating technical knowledge across generations, which is exactly what you would expect from a civilization that kept detailed astronomical records and performed complex mathematics. Now, let us talk about something even more controversial: acoustic engineering in ancient architecture. Researchers studying temple structures in various ancient cultures, including Mesopotamia, have discovered that many religious buildings were designed with specific acoustic properties. Certain chambers amplify particular frequencies. Stone arrangements create resonance effects. The dimensions of rooms and corridors produce standing waves at frequencies that correspond to human vocal ranges or specific musical notes. At face value, this is not shocking. Ancient architects certainly cared about acoustics. Priests wanted their voices to carry during ceremonies. Music was central to religious ritual. But some researchers, most notably studying sites in Egypt and Peru, have found that certain structures were engineered to resonate at frequencies that affect human consciousness. Infrasound, sound below the range of human hearing but still perceived by the body, can induce feelings of awe, anxiety, or presence. Frequencies around 110 Hz, which several ancient chambers naturally amplify, are known to affect brain activity and potentially induce altered states. Were ancient engineers deliberately creating spaces that used sound to manipulate psychological states? Did they understand that specific frequencies could enhance religious experience, make worshippers more receptive to spiritual teachings, or create the sensation of encountering the divine? Modern research into architectural acoustics and psychoacoustics suggests this is entirely possible. And if later cultures like the Egyptians and pre-Columbian Americans had this knowledge, is it so unreasonable to think the Sumerians, who pioneered temple architecture, might have possessed it first. The Sumerian word for temple, literally means house. But temples were not just houses for humans to worship in, they were houses where the gods supposedly dwelt. Ziggurats, those massive stepped platforms that dominated Sumerian cities, were not solid structures. They contained chambers, passages, and spaces whose functions we do not fully understand. We assume they were used for ritual, but what kind of ritual? What happened in those chambers at the top of ziggurats, in rooms designed with specific dimensions, specific orientations, specific acoustic properties? Some of the most intriguing evidence of ancient engineering comes from precision. The fit of stones in certain structures is so exact that you cannot slide a piece of paper between them. No mortar, no adhesive, just stone placed against stone, with tolerances measured in fractions of millimeters. How do you achieve that without modern surveying equipment, without power tools, without the ability to measure precisely? The answer given is time and patience. Skilled masons with bronze tools, working slowly, checking fit repeatedly, grinding and adjusting until the stones matched perfectly. That answer works for small-scale projects. But when you see it replicated across massive structures, across thousands of stone blocks, the time investment becomes implausible unless that culture had techniques we do not understand. Techniques for measuring precisely, techniques for shaping stone efficiently, perhaps techniques for softening stone temporarily to make it easier to work, then allowing it to harden again. That last suggestion sounds absurd, but some researchers, analyzing ancient stone working, have found evidence of vitrification, of surfaces that appear to have been subjected to extreme heat, potentially as part of the shaping process. I am not claiming ancient Mesopotamians had power tools or lasers. I am saying that the engineering precision evident in their structures suggests capabilities beyond what we typically attribute to Bronze Age technology. And if those capabilities existed, if there were techniques for working stone, manipulating sound, generating electricity, or controlling high temperatures that we do not fully understand, then those techniques came from somewhere. They were developed by someone through experimentation and refinement over long periods, which again brings us back to the question of knowledge inheritance. The Antikythera mechanism, that famous Greek device from 100 before the Common Era that calculated astronomical positions using bronze gears, is often cited as evidence of sophisticated ancient technology, but it is an anomaly. We have nothing like it before or after for over 1,000 years. Either the Greeks invented incredibly advanced clockwork mechanisms that were immediately forgotten, or they were replicating something older, something they had seen or heard about, but did not fully understand. The complexity of the Antikythera mechanism suggests a long tradition of precision gear cutting and mechanical engineering. Where is that tradition in the archaeological record? It does not exist. Unless it predates the Greeks and was lost in the catastrophes we have been discussing, the technology was there, the precision was there, the understanding of materials, acoustics, chemistry, and mechanics was there. We see the results, we hold the artifacts, we measure the structures. What we do not have is the continuity, the clear developmental path from simple to complex. And that absence, that gap in the record, keeps pointing us back to the same conclusion. Knowledge was inherited. Techniques were preserved. Technology survived from an earlier age and was adapted by later cultures who may not have fully understood the principles behind it, but recognized that it worked. The ancient engineers knew things. The question is who taught them. When a civilization collapses, most of its knowledge dies with it. Libraries burn. Masters die without training apprentices. Technical manuals are lost. Within a generation or two, sophisticated techniques become forgotten arts. Within a few centuries, even the memory that such knowledge existed fades into legend. This is the natural cycle of civilizational death. Complete amnesia follows catastrophe unless someone deliberately chooses to remember. And throughout history, someone always chose to remember, not by writing everything down in public archives, where invaders could burn it or kings could suppress it, but by creating closed circles of initiates, mystery schools, priesthoods, and secret societies whose entire purpose was preserving dangerous knowledge across dark ages. Knowledge that might threaten political power. Knowledge that might contradict official religious doctrine. Knowledge that might give its possessors advantages too valuable to share freely. These groups operated in shadows, passing information from master to student through carefully controlled initiation processes, ensuring continuity even when the world outside was falling apart. The Egyptians perfected this system. their priesthood was not just a religious institution, it was a knowledge preservation apparatus. Priests were mathematicians, astronomers, physicians, architects, and chemists. They controlled access to sacred texts kept in temple libraries. They performed rituals that doubled as mnemonic devices for encoding technical information. The mystery schools of Egypt, institutions like the House of Life at temples throughout the Nile Valley, taught initiates through progressive degrees of revelation. You started with basic literacy and religious stories. As you proved yourself worthy, you advanced to geometry, medicine, and astronomy. The highest levels allegedly revealed the deepest secrets, the knowledge inherited from the earliest times, from the Zep Tepi, the first time, when the gods walked among humans. Sound familiar? It should, because Egyptian mythology about the first time echoes Sumerian stories about antediluvian civilizations. The Egyptians claimed their knowledge came from Thoth, the god of wisdom and writing, who recorded all cosmic knowledge in hidden books before the Great Catastrophe. Later cultures identified Thoth with Hermes, creating the syncretized figure of Hermes Trismegistus, Hermes the Thrice Great, who became the legendary founder of Hermeticism and alchemy. The Hermetic texts that circulated in the Greek and Roman periods claimed to preserve ancient Egyptian wisdom, practical and spiritual knowledge reaching back thousands of years before the first pharaohs. Were these texts authentic ancient documents or Hellenistic forgeries? Probably both. Later authors undoubtedly added material, adapted ideas, and attributed their own philosophies to ancient authority to give them credibility. But the core concepts, the mathematical relationships, the astronomical observations, the chemical processes described in alchemical texts, many of these work. They produce results, which suggests that beneath the mystical language and symbolic imagery, there was genuine technical knowledge being preserved and transmitted through initiatory systems. The phrase, as above, so below, the fundamental Hermetic principle, is not just spiritual poetry, it is an encoding of astronomical knowledge. The movements of celestial bodies correspond to earthly cycles. Planetary positions correlate with seasonal changes. Understanding the macrocosm, the vast patterns of the cosmos, allows you to manipulate the microcosm, the materials and forces of the earthly realm. This is the foundation of both astronomy and alchemy, and both were taught in Egyptian mystery schools using symbolic language that outsiders could not penetrate. When Alexander conquered Egypt in 332 before the Common Era, Greek scholars gained access to these Egyptian institutions. They studied, they translated, they absorbed geometric and astronomical knowledge that transformed Greek mathematics and philosophy. Pythagoras supposedly spent 22 years studying in Egyptian temples before returning to Greece to found his own mystery school. Plato visited Egypt and incorporated Egyptian cosmological ideas into his dialogues. The entire Greek philosophical tradition shows clear influence from Egyptian sources, which themselves trace their knowledge back to Sumerian and even pre-Sumerian origins. And then Rome conquered Greece, and Roman elites adopted these mystery traditions: Mithraic cults, Orphic mysteries, Eleusinian mysteries. Each promised initiates access to hidden knowledge through ritual experience and progressive revelation. The structure was always the same: degrees of initiation, sworn secrecy, symbolic teaching, practical knowledge embedded in religious ceremony. These were not just spiritual movements. They were knowledge preservation networks operating across the Mediterranean world, keeping alive traditions that official institutions were often hostile toward. When Christianity became the dominant religion of the Roman Empire, these pagan mystery schools were suppressed. Temples were closed, priests were scattered, libraries were burned or seized, but the knowledge did not disappear. It went further underground. It fragmented into smaller, more secretive groups. Gnostic sects preserved Hermetic ideas mixed with Christian theology. Alchemists worked in private laboratories, coding their discoveries in symbolic language to avoid religious persecution. And eventually, these scattered traditions coalesced into what would become European esoteric societies. Freemasonry claims descent from medieval stonemason guilds, but its symbolism tells a different story. The square and compass, the checkered floor representing duality, the pillars named Jachin and Boaz, which appear in Sumerian temple architecture long before King Solomon's temple was built, the all-seeing eye within a triangle or pyramid, the emphasis on geometry as sacred knowledge, the degree system of progressive revelation. These are not medieval Christian symbols. These are ancient Near Eastern motifs, preserved through centuries of transmission, adapted to changing cultural contexts but maintaining core concepts about knowledge, hierarchy, and the responsibilities of those who possess dangerous information. Did Freemasons literally preserve Sumerian secrets? Not in any direct, unbroken lineage, but they preserved a way of thinking about knowledge, a structure for transmitting it across generations that mirrors the ancient mystery school model. And within their symbolic systems, there are echoes of very old ideas about builder gods descending from the heavens, ideas about sacred geometry encoding cosmic principles, ideas about the responsibility of initiates to guard certain truths from the unprepared masses. The Vatican archives hold 53 miles of shelving containing texts acquired over 2,000 years of church history. Access is restricted. Scholars must apply years in advance, specify exactly which documents they want to examine, and even then may be denied. Among those documents are materials from ancient libraries, texts confiscated from suppressed religious movements, archives from conquered civilizations. What Mesopotamian tablets sit in those stacks? What Hermetic manuscripts? What knowledge has the Church deemed too dangerous or too contradictory to its own narratives to allow public examination? I am not claiming the Vatican is hiding proof of ancient aliens. I am pointing out that institutions with vested interests in controlling historical narratives also control access to historical documents, and they have been doing this for millennia. The pattern repeats. Knowledge becomes dangerous. Institutions suppress it or restrict access. Secret societies form to preserve what cannot be safely made public. Initiates pass information through encoded teachings, and the public narrative becomes sanitized, simplified, stripped of anything that might challenge power structures or religious orthodoxy. The knowledge keepers are still operating. They always have been, because some information is too valuable to lose and too dangerous to share freely. Whether that knowledge concerns lost technologies, astronomical secrets, or uncomfortable truths about human origins, there have always been groups dedicated to remembering what the rest of the world has forgotten. And if you want to understand where the Sumerians got their knowledge, you have to acknowledge that knowledge preservation across civilizational collapse is not just possible, it is the norm. The mystery schools and secret societies we know about are just the ones that survived long enough to be documented. How many others operated in complete secrecy, passing their traditions to successors who erased all traces of the lineage? The initiates knew something. The question is whether we are ready to learn what they protected. Every ancient culture that bothered to track time beyond a single human lifespan came to the same unsettling conclusion. History does not move in a straight line. It moves in cycles. Ages rise and fall. Civilizations flourish and collapse. Catastrophes arrive with predictable regularity, wiping the slate clean so the pattern can begin again. The Greeks called these cycles the ages of man, from golden to silver to bronze to iron. Each one progressively degraded until the gods reset everything. The Hindus mapped out yugas spanning millions of years, vast cosmic cycles where creation and destruction dance in eternal rhythm. The Maya calculated their long count calendar to track cycles within cycles, culminating in dates when the cosmic order shifts fundamentally. And the Sumerians, the civilization we have been examining, understood time as circular, divided into great years, marked by the precession of the equinoxes, 25,920 years. That is how long it takes for Earth's wobbling axis to complete one full rotation, for the stars to return to their original positions relative to the seasons. The Sumerians divided this great year into 12 ages, each lasting 2,160 years, corresponding to the zodiacal constellations. We are living through the transition right now, moving from the age of Pisces, which began around the time of Christ and emphasized faith, sacrifice, and religious institutions, into the age of Aquarius, which supposedly brings revolution, knowledge, and the breakdown of hierarchical structures. Whether you believe astrology has any validity or not, the astronomical fact remains. The position of the sun against the backdrop of stars during the spring equinox is slowly shifting. Right now, it is transitioning from Pisces to Aquarius. That shift is measurable, it is real, and according to ancient traditions, these transitions are not smooth, they are catastrophic. But the Great Year is not the only cycle ancient astronomers tracked. Solar cycles repeat every 11 years as the sun's magnetic field flips, and sunspot activity fluctuates between maximum and minimum. We have confirmed this through modern observation, but the ancient Chinese were recording sunspot observations over 2,000 years ago, and Mesopotamian astronomical texts reference solar behavior in ways that suggest they understood this periodicity. Larger solar cycles operate on longer timescales. The sun experiences grand minimums, extended periods of reduced activity, roughly every 200 to 300 years. During these minimums, Earth's climate cools noticeably. The Maunder minimum from 1645 to 1715 produced the Little Ice Age in Europe, freezing rivers that normally did not freeze, collapsing harvests, and triggering social upheaval. Now imagine a solar event on the opposite extreme. A grand maximum combined with a massive coronal mass ejection, a burst of charged particles and electromagnetic radiation erupting from the sun's surface. In 1859, an event called the Carrington Event struck Earth. Auroras appeared as far south as the Caribbean. Telegraph systems across Europe and North America sparked and caught fire. Operators received electric shocks. Some telegraph lines continued working even after being disconnected from their power supplies, running purely on the electrical current induced by the geomagnetic storm. This happened when our technological infrastructure was primitive. If a Carrington-level event hit today, it would destroy power grids, satellite systems, communication networks. Modern civilization would experience cascade failures across every system dependent on electricity. And the Carrington event was not even particularly large by geological standards. Ice core data, preserving ancient atmospheric chemistry, shows that Earth has been hit by solar storms far more powerful. The Miyake event of 774 or 775, detected in tree rings worldwide, was approximately 10 times stronger than the Carrington event. If that happened today, the damage would be civilization ending in its scope. No power for months or years. No refrigeration. No water pumping. No fuel distribution. No supply chains. Within weeks, urban areas would become uninhabitable. Within months, starvation would be widespread. Within a year, the global population would be decimated. Could ancient texts describing fire from the sky, the anger of the sun god, the cosmic serpent devouring the world, be cultural memories of similar events? Solar storms produce visible phenomena, massive auroras, atmospheric electrical displays, glowing skies in colors that normally never appear. To pre-scientific observers, these would seem like divine wrath, cosmic warfare, the heavens themselves tearing apart. And if such an event coincided with other disasters, earthquakes triggered by electromagnetic induction, floods from rapid ice melt, crop failures from climate disruption, it would seem like the end of the world. Because for that civilization, it would be. Then there is the geological evidence we keep coming back to. Earth's magnetic field is not stable. It flips periodically, with the north and south magnetic poles swapping positions. These reversals happen on average every 200,000 to 300,000 years, though the interval is highly variable. The last one occurred 780,000 years ago. We are overdue. And the current weakening of Earth's magnetic field, measured consistently over the past century and a half, suggests we might be entering the early stages of a reversal or excursion, a temporary flip that corrects itself after a few thousand years. During a magnetic reversal, the field does not disappear, but it weakens significantly and becomes chaotic, with multiple poles forming and shifting unpredictably. This reduces protection from solar radiation and cosmic rays. Electronics fail. Navigation systems based on magnetic compasses become useless. Animals that migrate using magnetic sensing become disoriented, and the increased radiation reaching Earth's surface causes higher mutation rates, potential impacts on human health, and disruption of atmospheric chemistry that could trigger climate shifts. Ancient myths worldwide speak of the sky falling, of stars moving from their ordained positions, of the world being turned upside down. Plato's Timaeus references Egyptian priests telling Solon about periodic catastrophes that destroy civilizations, leaving only scattered survivors in mountain regions to rebuild from scratch. The Hopi speak of previous worlds ending in fire or ice or flood, with only the righteous preserved to populate the next world. The Book of Revelation describes cosmic signs, stars falling from heaven, the sun becoming black, the moon turning blood red. Are these purely symbolic visions, or garbled descriptions of actual phenomena witnessed by ancient peoples? The Sumerian texts state clearly that the Anunnaki will return. Not might return, will return, because in cyclical cosmology, everything that happened before will happen again. The gods descended, they taught humanity, they departed, and at the appointed time, when the cosmic clock completes its rotation, they return. Whether you interpret this literally as extraterrestrial visitors, or metaphorically as recurring opportunities for knowledge and advancement, the principle remains. The cycles continue. What rises must fall. What is lost will be found. What ended will begin again. Modern civilization is preparing. whether consciously or unconsciously. The Svalbard Global Seed Vault in Norway stores seeds from crops worldwide, preserving genetic diversity against global catastrophe. Knowledge repositories like the Internet Archive and the Long Now Foundation's 10,000-year clock attempt to safeguard information beyond the lifespan of individual nations or technologies. Billionaires build bunkers and buy remote properties in New Zealand or Patagonia, hedging against systemic collapse. On some level, we know what ancient peoples knew. This will not last. Something is coming, maybe solar, maybe magnetic, maybe geological, maybe a combination that creates cascade failures across multiple systems simultaneously. The difference between us and the Sumerians is that they accepted cyclical catastrophe as inevitable and focused on preservation. We pretend linear progress is permanent and prepare only at the margins. They built their knowledge into myth and ritual, ensuring it could survive even if writing was lost. We trust that hard drives and cloud servers will keep our information safe, ignoring how fragile digital storage actually is. They created initiation systems and mystery schools to pass crucial knowledge through dark ages. We assume Wikipedia and YouTube will always exist. When the cycle turns, when whatever catastrophe awaits actually arrives, humanity will face the same challenge the survivors of the Younger Dryas faced, that the post-flood Sumerians faced, that every recovering civilization has faced. What do we preserve? What knowledge is essential? How do we encode it to survive? Who will be the knowledge keepers for the next age? And will they remember us the way we are slowly, painfully, beginning to remember those who came before? The cosmic clock is ticking. It always has been. The question is not whether the cycle will turn again. The question is whether we will be wise enough to prepare for it when it does. So here we are, 2 hours into this journey through forgotten history, suppressed evidence, and uncomfortable questions. We have examined clay tablets that academic institutions keep in storage rather than translate. We have traced genetic anomalies that suggest our species is more hybrid than we have been taught. We have looked at astronomical knowledge that should not exist in Bronze Age civilizations. We have found engineering precision that defies explanation, using the tools we assume ancient people possessed. And we have confronted the possibility, remote but persistent, that human civilization is far older and far stranger than the textbooks admit. The evidence does not prove ancient aliens. It does not confirm that the Anunnaki were literal extraterrestrial visitors conducting genetic experiments. It does not validate every wild theory about Atlantis or Lemuria or any other lost continent. What it does prove, beyond any reasonable doubt, is that the official narrative is incomplete. There are gaps, significant gaps, periods where knowledge appears without precedent, where capabilities exceed what gradual development should produce, where ancient texts describe events and beings that do not fit comfortably into our categories of myth and history. The Sumerians were not the first. They said so themselves, repeatedly, in texts we can read today if we choose to take them seriously. Before them came the Ubaid culture, with their unsettling figurines and sophisticated temple architecture. Before the Ubaid came whoever built Göbekli Tepe and watched the stars with precision that required thousands of years of accumulated observation. Before them came populations we can detect only through genetic signatures, ghost lineages that contributed to our DNA and then vanished, leaving no cities, no monuments, only the faint chemical traces in our chromosomes that prove they once existed. Something happened. Multiple somethings, probably. Catastrophes that modern geology is only beginning to acknowledge. The Younger Dryas impact. Rapid sea level rise that drowned coastal civilizations. Solar events that disrupted technology and climate. Magnetic excursions that left populations vulnerable to radiation and disoriented by changing skies. Each event erased portions of human history, pushing survivors back towards subsistence, forcing them to rebuild from fragments and memories. And each time, some knowledge was preserved, passed down through oral tradition, encoded in mythology, protected by priesthoods and mystery schools, waiting for a future generation curious enough and brave enough to ask what those stories really mean. We are that generation. We have the tools now. DNA sequencing, ground-penetrating radar, satellite imagery revealing hidden structures, computer analysis of ancient texts, dating methods that can pinpoint events to within decades. The technology exists to finally answer questions that have haunted humanity since we first wondered where we came from. The only thing preventing answers is institutional resistance, academic gatekeeping, and our own reluctance to accept that we might have been wrong about fundamental aspects of our past. The mysteries remain because we allow them to remain. Those 100,000 untranslated tablets sitting in museum storage will stay there until enough people demand their translation. The underwater ruins off coastlines worldwide will stay unexplored until funding priorities shift toward marine archaeology. The connections between ancient cultures separated by oceans will stay unexplained until we admit that prehistoric humans were more sophisticated than we have given them credit for. And the texts describing contact between early humans and beings from elsewhere, whether those beings were gods, aliens, or simply survivors of an earlier human civilization, will stay dismissed as primitive mythology until we develop the intellectual humility to consider that ancient people might have been recording real events using the only language and concepts available to them. The legacy we inherit is mystery, questions without easy answers, evidence that challenges comfortable assumptions, and the responsibility to keep asking, keep investigating, keep pushing against the boundaries of accepted knowledge. Because somewhere in those clay tablets, somewhere in our genetic code, somewhere in the astronomical calculations preserved from Bronze Age observatories, is the truth about who we are and where we really came from. Rest well, fellow seekers. The mysteries will still be here tomorrow. They have waited this long. They can wait a little longer while you sleep. And when you wake, perhaps you will look at history differently, with eyes open to the possibility that humanity's story is far deeper, far older, and far more extraordinary than anyone has been willing to admit. If this journey through forbidden history resonated with you, if these questions matter to you as much as they matter to me, then subscribe to this channel. There is so much more to uncover, so many more connections to make, so many more uncomfortable truths waiting in the archives, in the ground, in the spaces between what we have been told and what the evidence actually shows. This is just the beginning. The real investigation is only starting. And maybe, just maybe, if enough of us start asking the right questions, we will finally get the answers our ancestors tried so hard to preserve for us. Sweet dreams. And remember, the past is not dead. It is not even past. It is right here, waiting to be remembered.